Snow still lay thick on the platform steps when Emily Hartman vanished from Anchorage, Alaska, a city of 183,000 people locked in the grip of early winter storms. The last night of November began with a blast of frigid wind that whipped down with a blizzard, dumping more than a foot of snow across the entire depot area. At 9:58 p.m., a station employee saw Emily, a 19-year-old fresh off her shift, standing beside the third lamppost, clutching a small canvas bag with both arms, while her breath formed thin clouds in front of her face. She was waiting for the night train back to Wasilla, a gray wool scarf wrapped around her neck, and the worn old gloves she always wore on late shifts. The employee watched Emily's figure cross the slippery stone walkway, her dark green coat becoming the last streak of color against the blinding white of the storm. Just seconds later, her silhouette melted into the swirling snow and disappeared without leaving a single trace. What happened in the next 180 minutes would haunt Alaska for the next 3 decades. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss the latest cases. November 1979 in Anchorage opened with a fresh, thin layer of snow covering the ground, biting winds lashing the metal rooftops and rattling the long rows of heat lamps that lined the streets. The roads were starting to ice over, reflecting a patchy, washed-out light that looked like breath falling back to the ground before it could fully dissipate. Emily Hartman, 19 years old, finished a late shift at a small shop near 4th Avenue, pulled her coat collar up high, and hurried through the skin-cutting cold to Anchorage Depot to catch the only night train that would take her home to Wasilla. From a distance, the station appeared as a dim block of light in the blowing snow, its rows of metal benches so cold that even a light touch would send a numb burning sensation through your fingers. The damp stone floor soaked up the chill rising from the ground, and beneath the vast overhang of the roof, the wind screamed through every gap, producing a low, long, razor-sharp sound. People later recalled seeing Emily standing near the third lamppost, hugging her coat tight to her body, her eyes flickering with tension, occasionally glancing toward the entrance, as if she were waiting for someone or afraid someone was approaching. When the night train pulled in, passengers poured out of the front cars, their body heat and footsteps stirring the icy air. A small group boarded, others left the station. The snow fell harder, erasing footprints and quickly turning the platform into a flat, colorless expanse. As the crowd thinned and the space grew quiet again, no one could still see Emily where they had just seen her standing. She did not board the train, and she never appeared at any of the exits. That night passed in silence. Her family waited until nearly dawn, but Emily never came home. They called her friends, her workplace, even the train station. No one knew where Emily had gone or whether she had ever left Anchorage. Finally, with worry piling higher and higher, the family reported to the Alaska State Troopers that Emily was missing. The Alaska State Troopers received the report from the Hartman family that morning, while snow still sat in small drifts on porches and the winter sun hung low, casting a dim light that made it hard to tell day from night. The duty officer took the initial statement, then, following 1979 procedure, filled out a missing person report with the bare minimum fields, physical description, last seen time, and risk factors. The risk level box was marked high because Emily had disappeared in extreme weather, a blizzard that could cover any trace in an hour. 2 troopers were dispatched to the Hartman home in Wasilla, carrying a blank white case file for notes and a Polaroid camera for any scene documentation. Inside the small house, they began interviewing each family member to build background. First came Emily's last 24 hours. Shift ended in the evening, then she went straight to Anchorage Depot to catch the train. No plans to meet anyone, no unusual calls or messages that day, no mention of leaving town or anything that would make her want to avoid her family. The troopers asked about personal relationships, any conflicts with coworkers, any boyfriend or acquaintance who had recently acted strangely or threateningly, any signs of emotional instability in recent weeks. Every answer circled back to the same point. Nothing that would explain Emily suddenly vanishing. They kept digging, travel habits, regular hangouts, the people she saw most often, any relationships that could lead to conflict. Every piece of information was penciled onto the investigation form. No indication of leaving the state. No luggage taken. No prior notice. No notable conflicts. One trooper wrote in the margin, "Stable personality, disappearance does not fit established pattern." When the interviews wrapped up, they compiled a priority list of people to question next, based on what the family provided: co-workers from the evening shift, the store manager, a few close friends in Wasilla, train station staff, and a handful of names Emily had mentioned in recent weeks. The list was ranked by how likely each person was to have had contact with her in the narrow window before she vanished. The troopers closed the file for the moment, thanked the family, and stepped out of the warm house back into a sky so cold their breath instantly turned to white frost. In their hands now was the first set of background information, the starting piece to follow the trail of a girl who disappeared at the exact moment snow buried every answer. The troopers left Wasilla and returned to Anchorage Depot that same afternoon, when the snow had been blown into long streaks along the entrance paths and the metal roof rattled faintly under the cutting wind. They started by requesting the previous night's station log, a hardbound green book recording staff names, shift times, and any incidents. There was no note about a passenger in distress or anyone receiving special assistance, and more importantly, Emily's name did not appear on the list of passengers who boarded the night train. Railroad representatives confirmed that the ticketing system back then was not as accurate as later versions, but if a passenger had boarded, the baggage handler or ticket seller would at least have some verbal record, especially on a cold, nearly empty night like that one. The troopers continued by interviewing every station employee still on duty from the previous shift. The ticket seller vaguely remembered a young woman asking about train times, but wasn't sure it was Emily. The baggage handler saw no one matching the description board the rear car. The night security guard only recalled a girl standing near the third lamppost, but didn't know which way she went because visibility was blocked when the train arrived. They wrote down every tiny detail, trying to sift overlapping memories for the truth. Next, the troopers asked to review the procedures for opening and closing station doors. The north door closed early because of snow buildup. The south door stayed open all night for passengers, while the east side door was only unlocked when a train was at the platform. The number of people passing through each door was recalled only by rough estimate, not recorded. Still, no one remembered seeing a young woman leave the station alone in the period after the night train stopped. From these scattered pieces, the troopers began sketching a rough map, marking where witnesses had seen Emily, the first dot near the ticket counter. Where one employee dimly recalled a girl asking the time, a second dot by the third lamppost. Where an elderly couple had seen Emily huddled against the wind, and a small arrow marking the direction the security guard thought she might have moved when the train pulled in. The map offered no answers, but it made Emily's final presence clearer. She appeared at multiple spots inside the station, yet never appeared at any exit after the train left. That was something the troopers could not ignore. Because in that night's weather, and the relatively compact layout of Anchorage Depot, a person disappearing without anyone seeing them leave the area was too big an anomaly to dismiss as simple witness memory error. The troopers continued their work at Anchorage Depot by canvassing every witness present during the window. Emily was there, trying to gather as much data as possible from human memory before time made it fragmented and unreliable. In the first 2 days, they collected a total of 15 statements, each one a small shard of the larger picture the troopers had to piece together themselves. To avoid information distortion, they divided the witnesses into 3 separate groups. Group 1 consisted of 2 people considered direct eyewitnesses: the elderly couple who saw Emily standing near the third lamppost, and the night security guard who saw a young woman in the pool of light cast from the roof overhang. Both described Emily standing slightly hunched from the cold, her eyes repeatedly looking toward the station entrance rather than at the stopped train. Most strikingly, both insisted that in the few minutes the crowd surged when the train arrived, Emily vanished, as if she melted into the snow. No one saw which direction she went, even though the area was not large enough to completely lose someone. Group 2 contained 6 passers-by, witnesses who did not clearly see Emily, but remembered details about the space, the timing, or her movements. A middle-aged man recalled a young woman in a dark coat walking quickly past the ticket counter, but he wasn't sure it was Emily because he only glanced at her while dragging his luggage. A woman who worked nearby said she saw the silhouette of a girl near the lamppost, but couldn't tell if she was alone or talking to someone because the arriving train blocked the view. A tourist from the lower 48 only remembered someone in dark clothing standing near the metal benches, but could not describe a face. These statements lacked the precision to confirm identity, but they provided clues that Emily was still inside the station area right up until the train departed. Group 3 included 7 witnesses with possibly relevant information. People who did not claim to have seen Emily, but noticed something unusual around the same time. A cleaning woman heard hurried footsteps coming from the stairs to the platform, but when she turned around there was no one there. A young passenger remembered seeing a man standing alone near the 3rd lamppost area, not talking to anyone, not holding luggage, just staring in Emily's direction. He described the man as wearing a heavy coat and a hood that partially covered his face, standing no more than a few steps from Emily. When asked why he noticed the man, he simply said the guy stood too still while everyone else was moving, a detail the troopers found particularly interesting. Another witness, a woman waiting for a ride, said she saw 2 figures standing close together but could not tell if they knew each other because the heavy snow severely limited visibility. In their notebooks, the troopers underlined in red the description, "A man standing a few steps from Emily," and added the note, "Could be an ordinary passenger waiting for the train, or maybe not." They could not rule out that the man was just someone passing through, but they also could not ignore the possibility he was involved. The fact that 2 separate witnesses remembered a man standing near Emily made that detail stand out as the rare point of overlap among otherwise scattered statements. The troopers noted that the man's position near the lamppost, barely moving, suggested 2 possibilities. Either he was waiting for someone boarding the train, or he was watching Emily and waiting for the right moment to approach. In bad weather with very few people at the station, any unusually motionless behavior became something that demanded close scrutiny. Still, they were fully aware that witness memory is easily affected by limited visibility in blowing snow, weak lighting, and the large train blocking sight lines. For that reason, the troopers made no early conclusions. Instead, they focused on compiling every detail related to Emily's and the strange man's positions, redrawing a time-space diagram of the station on their map, using 3 different colors for the 3 witness groups, hoping that within those layers of information, a strong enough pattern would emerge to lead them to the next step of the investigation. Troopers left the Anchorage depot and retraced the exact route Emily had taken before she vanished, starting from the back door of the store where she worked, and continuing along the streets that led toward the train station. It was late afternoon, the sky a dull lead gray, with light snow drifting down onto the already frozen pavement, forming a thin glaze that reflected the pale glow from the few streetlights still working. They walked slowly, examining every detail, noting every spot that could have made Emily vulnerable to approach or surveillance. The route was less than a mile long, but passed through numerous dark stretches, including areas with weak lighting or shadows cast by the overhanging awnings of stores that had closed early. At each section, the troopers stopped to assess visibility. In some places, a person standing just 20 paces away would already blend into the darkness behind dumpsters or building vents. They marked the areas where light was blocked by signs, places where a young woman walking alone might not notice someone standing at the edge of the shadows. One trooper crouched to examine the thin ice along the curb, noting that if someone had been waiting, their footsteps would have been almost completely muffled by the fresh snow, meaning Emily would have heard no warning of an approach. When they reached the intersection of 4th Avenue and a narrow alley, the troopers immediately recognized it as a clear high-risk point, tight corner, dim light, and old posters flapping on the brick walls. They concluded that a single person pressed against the wall, leaning just slightly out of a pedestrian's direct line of sight, could close in on a target without drawing attention. The route then led the troopers into the area right next to the row of local bars and taverns. In the 1970s, this strip was notorious as a late-night hangout for workers, tourists, and locals who drank until the early hours. 3 bars nearby stayed open until dawn, which meant a heavy flow of intoxicated people coming and going. The troopers noted the heightened risk from the possibility of encountering unstable strangers, especially in harsh weather, that drove many to huddle inside brightly lit windows and only stumble out once thoroughly drunk. Some drunks might shout or make noise, but others could quietly follow someone without anyone noticing, since the surroundings were chaotic and it was hard to distinguish genuinely suspicious footsteps from the general din. Additionally, the service corridors behind the bars were common temporary shelters for the homeless, who tucked themselves into wind-blocked corners. The troopers observed remnants of half-extinguished campfires, tin cans, and old blankets, evidence that people regularly passed through or stayed here at night. They drew no hasty conclusions, but recorded that individuals without shelter tend to move slowly and scan their surroundings more broadly than the average person. A homeless person might have seen Emily or someone following her, yet they could just as easily have been the one to approach her if the opportunity arose. While evaluating the route, the troopers also considered the frequency of night patrols on these streets. They discovered that in winter, due to bad weather, patrol units were reduced, and police cars passed through only a few times per night instead of continuously as in summer. This created long windows with no law enforcement presence at all, allowing any abnormal activity to occur undetected. One trooper stood at a small intersection where light from a street lamp was blocked by a large electronics store sign and tried to picture Emily walking past. From that position, someone following could stay close without being seen. Though the distance from Emily's workplace to the train station was short, it contained multiple factors that made her easy to tail: blind corners with blocked light, deep shadows, the presence of drunks and homeless individuals, and sparse police patrols. The entire route was like a chain of small danger points, and the troopers understood that if just one of those points became the site of an approach, all traces could be erased by snow in a matter of minutes. After completing the full walk, they returned to the Anchorage depot with a map clearly marking every risk point and every stretch where a stranger could have closed in on Emily unnoticed. Rather than providing answers, the field notes only exposed a harsher truth. The path Emily took was not a safe corridor, but a series of blind spots where an approach was almost inevitable in the context of Anchorage in the winter of 1979. As night fell earlier than usual, and the winter light thinned to a faint gold wash over the cold snow, the SAR team was mobilized and began a small-scale search along the exact same route Emily had walked. The biting cold turned every breath into instant fog, and footsteps on the fresh snow made a soft, almost choked sound, muffled by the white blanket covering the street. The troopers and rescue teams split into 3 groups, moving parallel along the same axis to ensure nothing was missed, even in sections where light was blocked or visibility limited. Each group was tasked with scanning every square meter, crouching low to examine the snow surface and any areas that might hide traces easily overlooked from a standing position. They started at the back door of the store where Emily had left and headed straight toward the Anchorage depot, following the precise path she had taken the night she disappeared. SAR used probes to test snow depth, hoping to find areas of unnatural compression that might suggest someone had stood, knelt, or been pushed down. But the thick layer of new snow had obliterated everything, as if no footprints had ever existed. Each stretch of road was mentally divided into small grids, and SAR members walked in a zigzag pattern to cross-check coverage. In the dark sections near brick walls, they aimed high-powered flashlights into every crack and corner, searching for small dropped items like a scarf, glove, or anything Emily might have lost during an approach. Yet the strong wind kept covering everything with fresh snow the moment it fell, creating a perfectly smooth surface where even slight disturbances were impossible to detect. When they reached the area near the intersection of 4th Avenue and the narrow alley, the spot previously identified as high risk, SAR immediately fanned out to check the snow-filled ditches on both sides of the road. These drainage channels often form deep troughs. If someone had been shoved hard or slipped, a body could easily end up there. However, when a trooper used a small shovel to part the top layer, all that appeared were uniform sheets of ice, no foreign objects, no signs of movement, no disturbance whatsoever. They continued to the bar area, where wind gusts bounced back off tall walls, whipping snow into spirals right at the edge of the walkway. SAR checked under the overpass using primitive infrared scanners, crude tools for the time, but still capable of detecting unusual heat signatures, such as lingering warmth from a large object. However, the ambient temperature was so low that any signal was almost completely nullified. Anything that had once been there had long since been dragged down to the near absolute cold of the surrounding air. Along the stretch leading to the train station, the rescue team carefully examined bushes that might conceal items or traces. The shrubs were flattened by snow, their branches sticking out like frozen fingers and containing nothing but a few rotted leaves. SAR probed beneath the canopy with sticks in case something had fallen into the gaps between branches, but they found only gravel and ice. One trooper tried to imagine that if Emily had been pulled away or slammed against a wall, the snow near the base might have been pushed aside. But that observation was nearly useless. The overnight snowfall was so heavy that every trace from the previous night had been completely leveled. Areas of unusually deep snow were not signs of disturbance, but simply drifts created by the wind. When the lead group neared the stairs down to the platform, they checked each step beneath the thick snow cover. The stairs were rock-hard with cold, showing no deep boot prints typical of someone stepping into thick snow or of snow falling around an obstruction. The SR team even used small picks to dig down, hoping for a layer of compressed snow, but beneath was only undisturbed fresh snowfall, perfectly intact as if no one had passed the night before. Some members paid special attention to narrow grooves in the sidewalk, where wind often cleared snow faster, creating deeper channels than the surrounding surface. They shone lights into these grooves because small objects, coins, lighters, bits of fabric, sometimes got trapped there, but there was nothing except snow and ice. The searchers began to confront the obvious truth. Any trace that existed during the previous night's snowfall had been erased almost completely within minutes, and then further smoothed by high winds throughout the night. When they approached the end of the route near the platform, one trooper wrote in his notes, "Everything looks like it fell fresh this morning. If anything happened here, it's gone as if it never was." The SAR team regrouped to report to the field commander. The entire route from Emily's workplace to the train station had been thoroughly searched, including ditches, under the overpass, bushes, and the smallest grooves. No physical evidence, no footprints, no disturbance that could be linked to Emily. The new snow had wiped away both traces and hope, leaving only the silent question hanging in the frigid air. How could Emily vanish over such a short distance, right in the middle of a city where every sign was hidden by a blizzard, faster than any human search could keep up? As full darkness fell, the troopers and SAR team were forced to shift focus to the area immediately around the Anchorage depot, especially under the overpass and the rail tracks right next to the station, where strong winds from the Neck River direction funneled through, dropping the temperature further and compacting snow into layers that were hard to distinguish. Under the weak glow of streetlights, the space beneath the overpass stretched out like a cold, silent void where natural light barely reached. To counter this, the troopers deployed high-powered searchlights, the kind used for nighttime operations in icy conditions, mounted on tall stands so the beams could sweep wide and deep into every pocket beneath the bridge. As the cold, sharp beams cut through, the snow reflected blinding white streaks, while the concrete support pillars emerged as tall, dark gray blocks, standing motionless in the night. Every crack, crevice, and wind-packed snowdrift beneath the bridge was illuminated and inspected. Troopers crouched to probe areas where snow appeared unusually compressed, but when they pushed probes deep, they found only pristine uniform layers, evidence that no heavy object had ever leaned there. No body had fallen or been dragged. After covering the entire underpass, they moved to the rail tracks, an area considered sensitive because of the sudden temperature drops and the danger it posed to any pedestrian in this weather. The tracks ran parallel to the station for over 100 meters, flanked by gravel almost completely buried under snow. Only scattered patches of gravel showed where wind had scoured the surface bare. The troopers walked the tracks, shining flashlights close to the ground, looking for signs of a slip, a fall, or someone trying to grab the rails. In many previous winter missing persons cases they had worked, traces around the tracks were often the first clue: unusual depressions, long skid marks, or items dropped while a victim tried to orient themselves. But tonight, all they saw was a flawless, almost hand-laid blanket of snow. No dents, no drag marks, no footprints, except those made by the search team itself. The troopers paused at the third light pole, the spot where a witness had last seen Emily. From there, the view opened onto the entire platform, the main tracks, and the path down to the open lot behind the station. A younger trooper knelt close to the snow, sweeping his flashlight inch by inch, searching for tiny dropped objects: a button, a scrap of scarf, a strand of yarn, a piece of metal, anything that might have belonged to Emily. They lightly dug through thin layers of snow, right at the base of the pole, where wind eddies could trap small items in corners, but beneath was only snow and cold stone. No compression, no change in the surface that would indicate someone had stood there long or been approached from behind. They swept light along the edge of the platform, where snow might have been blown into narrow gaps between metal beams, but the beams only threw back uniform white stripes, everything suspiciously even. The silence was so complete that the only sounds were wind scraping the railing and the soft crunch of the search team's own boots. They moved toward the edge of the open lot behind the station, which offered a lower-angle view of the overpass. The sparse bushes there were pressed nearly flat by snow, brittle and white, incapable of hiding anything. Troopers gently prodded the bushes with sticks to check if anything was caught among the dry branches. But there was nothing except small chunks of ice that broke off when disturbed. One trooper got down on his knees at ground level and brushed snow away from the concrete base of the overpass wall, where drifts piled deepest. He looked for push marks, deep depressions, or faint scratches indicating something heavy had been dragged across. But even after clearing the top layer, the snow beneath remained uniform, flat, smooth, and untouched. He stood up, exhaled a long plume of white breath, and shook his head at the group leader. They continued to the far end of the tracks, where wind whirlpools had built small rolling drifts. The troopers broke each drift apart by hand, hoping to find something buried inside, but every one was empty. When they finished sweeping the entire area around the station and the overpass, a veteran trooper made the observation everyone already knew was true. If there had been drag marks or anything dropped last night, the new snow covered it hours ago. That statement was entered into the duty log as the most accurate summary of the field conditions. In Alaska winter disappearances, nature can erase all evidence in a single night, and in Emily's case, that appeared to be exactly what had happened. What the search team gained after hours of combing under the bridge and around the tracks was only the silence of snow cover. A white, indifferent plain that swallowed every clue with absolute finality. Any answers that might once have been there, if they ever existed, were now buried beneath layers of wind and falling snow from the previous night. Leaving the troopers with a clear but hopeless conclusion, the area around the train station offered no direct sign of where Emily went, who she might have encountered, or how she disappeared. With no results from the intensive searches around the station and under the overpass, SAR moved into a larger-scale operation. The troopers held a quick meeting with the rescue commander to set the expanded search radius based on estimates of how far a person could travel in the extreme cold of an Alaskan November in 1979. They agreed that in deep sub-zero temperatures, high winds and icy surfaces, a pedestrian would struggle to keep moving for more than about 40 minutes, even if healthy and purposeful. That meant if Emily had left the station on her own 2 feet, her maximum range would be roughly 2 to 3 kilometers. However, to account for variables, being forced to move by a stranger, becoming disoriented in blowing snow, or taking unpredictable shortcuts, the troopers chose a concentric circle search method, a standard technique for winter disappearances. They started with the Anchorage depot as the center, Emily's last sighted location, and expanded outward in rings of 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers, and finally 10 kilometers. Each ring was drawn on the map in colored circles marking the area SAR would cover in each phase. In the 2 kilometers ring, they focused primarily on areas adjacent to Emily's known route, pedestrian paths leading to main streets, narrow alleys behind the bars, vacant lots beside roads, and abandoned winter parking areas. SAR broke into small teams linked like a net, searching every square meter. They walked in a horizontal line, maintaining fixed spacing to leave no gaps. Helmet lights and flashlights swept across every bush, utility pole and wall edge. The thick snow made finding tracks even harder. A single new layer was enough to completely bury footprints, drag marks, or small dropped items. At the outer edge of the 2 kilometers ring, where wind was stronger and terrain opened up toward side roads, SAR paid special attention to drainage ditches running alongside walkways. These were places an exhausted person might slip into, or where someone else might push a victim to hide the incident. But the ditches were sealed under solid ice with no cracks on the surface, proving no heavy object had fallen in overnight. After completing the 2 kilometers ring with no leads, the troopers ordered the move to the 5 kilometers ring. This area was far larger, extending to the edges of sparse residential neighborhoods, small industrial zones, and seldom used winter roads. They checked dozens of abandoned lots, unused warehouses, and slippery secondary roads leading away from downtown. SAR used ice probes on deep snow in low-lying terrain, places that could conceal a dropped object or a body. But it was only layer upon layer of uniform snow. Poles, derelict garages, and wooden fences were all closely examined under lights. No scraps of cloth, no personal items, no slide or drag marks. An experienced older trooper who had worked many blizzard searches remarked that if Emily had walked out of the station area in that weather, she almost certainly would have left at least one small sign, uneven depressions, something dropped due to numbness or wind. Yet the 5 kilometers ring was pristine, no different from untouched snow. By the 10 kilometers ring, the troopers knew the odds of finding small physical evidence were extremely low, but they still swept it to rule out the possibility that Emily had been forced into a vehicle and dumped in the outskirts. The 10 kilometers ring reached roads leading toward Eagle River, touching sparse forest edges and isolated mobile home clusters. SAR used snowmobiles to cover distance faster. Whenever something looked odd, an oversized drift or snow shaped unusually by wind, they stopped immediately to check by hand and shine lights deep into the ice. But every suspicious spot turned out to be nothing more than the work of high winds and uneven ground, not human activity. When the teams finished the 10 kilometers ring and returned to the rally point, the SAR commander compiled the final report: no sign of a body, no dropped items, no clothing matching Emily's description. All they had found were thick layers of snow blanketing the city and turning anything that might have existed the previous night into an unrecoverable past. The troopers logged the conclusion: no evidence of pedestrian travel beyond station perimeter, no physical evidence, no exceptions. And though the wording was brief, everyone understood what it meant. They were facing one of the most dangerous scenarios in winter missing persons investigations, a person who could vanish completely in minutes, with the snow taking care of the rest. When the ground search yielded no tangible traces whatsoever, the troopers shifted to a widespread information campaign to broaden the chances of gathering leads from communities across the entire state. The first thing they did was draft a concise but accurate description of Emily: her age, height, build, hair color, the last clothing she was seen in, along with the detail that she had disappeared in harsh weather conditions at Anchorage Depot. That description was sent to local radio stations, including the small broadcast towers that served scattered suburban and wilderness edge communities, places where radio was often the only source of information during blizzard days. Announcers read the missing person bulletin during morning and evening peak hours, repeating it day after day in the hope that someone who had passed through the train station area or spotted Emily somewhere in the city would recognize the information. The description was also printed and mailed to local police stations, small town halls, and post offices statewide, places people still visited regularly to pick up mail, ship packages, or handle personal paperwork, especially in an era when Alaska had few public information outlets. At each location, the flyer was pinned to bulletin boards right beside classified ads, winter hunting notices, or blizzard warnings, so everyone who walked in could see it. At the same time, the troopers reviewed the list of all cases recorded as runaway teenage girls in the previous 3 months to rule out the possibility that Emily had been confused with one of those incidents. In the late 1970s, young women leaving home without notice was not uncommon, especially in small towns where they sought jobs or escaped from family pressure. However, after examining the files and speaking with each local police office, the troopers confirmed that none of the cases matched Emily's physical description or circumstances. There were no records of her leaving the state, no notes about changing jobs, and most importantly, no indication whatsoever that Emily had ever expressed a desire to leave Wasilla or Anchorage. Ruling out the runaway scenario allowed them to focus on a genuine missing person investigation instead of letting the case get lumped in with the voluntary departures that were common at the time. Still, the nature of information flow in 1979 created major limitations. There was no centralized missing person alert system, no instant notification mechanism that could reach every law enforcement agency in minutes, as it would decades later. Every connection had to be made by landline telephone, mailed letters, or radio contact, all depended on people and the moment they received the message. One trooper was assigned to contact highway checkpoints, asking whether anyone had seen a young woman walking alone on the highway in the middle of a blizzard night. But the responses were all the same. No one matched the description, no one appeared to be in distress or asking for help. When the radio aired Emily's description for the 10th time in a single day, the trooper's commander wrote a simple yet heavy note in the duty log. Lack of a centralized alert system is making our response slower than desired. In Alaska at that time, the harsh environment and vast distances between communities turned information transmission into a race against time that humans frequently lost. And in Emily's case, they knew that if someone had seen her outside the depot area, the window to verify the scene or recover traces could already have been erased by the blizzard before troopers could arrive. Nevertheless, broadcasting the description statewide remained a critical step to ensure that if anyone, a driver, a pedestrian, or even a homeless person sheltering for the night, had seen anything unusual, they would know the entire state was looking for Emily. In that way, the troopers hoped to create a slim opening, a phone call, a casually remembered detail, a scrap of information surfacing from some far-flung corner of Alaska's enormous landscape. But by the time the final bulletin of the day went out, no worthwhile response had come in, and the community's silence only underscored what the troopers had suspected from the start. Emily had vanished without a trace, and the snow had already buried whatever answers might have existed that night. When every ground effort fell into absolute silence, the troopers and SAR team decided to expand the search vertically, deploying a Bell 206 helicopter, the lightweight model commonly used for winter patrol and mountain rescue missions in Alaska. In the late 1970s, few agencies possessed specialized equipment for aerial searches, but SAR's Bell 206 was equipped with a high-powered searchlight mounted under the fuselage, capable of sweeping the ground over a wide radius even in falling snow and moonless conditions. The helicopter lifted off from Anchorage amid the loud roar of the engine, its rotors slicing through the thick, frigid air and whipping up swirling clouds of snow around the pad. Inside, SAR members strapped in, pulled their hoods tight against the drafts, and spread out the search area map on the floor, marked with red lines connecting Anchorage Depot to the eastern mountain ranges and fanning out toward Eklutna Lake in an ever-widening grid. The first area they scanned was the edge of Chugach State Park, a vast strip of forest and mountain that swallowed entire patches of winter darkness, where anyone who wandered off trail could be paralyzed by sub-zero cold in minutes. From the air, the helicopter's light cut broad white swaths across the dark ground, illuminating snow-laden tree canopies, frozen creeks and narrow trails winding beneath thin ice. Those trails were used by locals in summer for hiking, fishing, or climbing, but in November they became deadly, buried under deep snow that hid any sign of passage. SAR carefully swept the trails closest to Anchorage because if Emily, for whatever reason, had left the depot heading east, this could be where she accidentally entered. The helicopter flew low, maintaining steady altitude so the light could penetrate the narrow gaps between tree trunks. The spotlight operator moved the beam slowly along the terrain's contours, looking for anomalies, depressions in the snow, drag marks, dark patches that didn't belong to trees or rocks. But all they saw were seamless layers of fresh, untouched snow, stretching out like an endless plain. Northeast winds gusted hard, rocking the aircraft and forcing the pilot to climb when hitting strong turbulence near the slopes. SAR noted that if Emily had been taken into the forest by any means, her tracks had already vanished beneath the heavy snowfall all night long. After more than an hour, sweeping the western edge of Chugach State Park, the helicopter turned toward Eklutna Lake, one of the most treacherous areas near Anchorage and routinely flagged by rescue teams as high risk for winter accidents. At that time of year, Eklutna Lake was nothing more than a wide, dark sheet of ice, reflecting none of the helicopter's light except the streak that swept across it. Surrounding the lake were hills and sparse forest, with deep ravines that could hide a large object from anyone on the ground. The troopers were especially interested in this area because its terraced terrain made it easy for a pedestrian to lose direction after straying just a few dozen yards off the main path. SAR swept the entire southern shore, where the ground was lower and clusters of bushes sagged under heavy snow. The light passing over them cast distorted, shifting shadows on the ice as the helicopter banked. Still, there was nothing unusual, no depressions, no disturbed snow, no sign of shelter or discarded items. As the helicopter moved to the eastern shore, where the terrain rose steeply, SAR focused the beam into rock crevices and rarely used trails. They knew that if someone had deliberately removed Emily from the depot area, Eklutna Lake was one plausible direction for concealing traces. But every deep sweep into the ravines revealed only hard ice and cold stone. Even in spots where strong wind had scoured the snow into ribbons, exposing bare ground or rock, there were no unusual marks. One SAR member pressed against the window, using snow-resistant binoculars to examine areas the light couldn't fully reach. He scanned every bush, every thin stand of trees, every faint crack in the ice, hoping for a scrap of fabric or sign of movement. But the view repeated endlessly: snow, rock, ice, and white silence. The helicopter made one more wide circle over the corridor between Chugach Forest and Eklutna Lake, where secondary roads led out of the city. Those roads saw little winter traffic, so if someone wanted to move a person undetected, this could be a logical route. Yet even in the most inaccessible sections, the powerful light illuminated only thick, undisturbed snow with nothing beneath it. On the return to Anchorage, the helicopter made one final pass over the depot from above. But as with previous sweeps, all that was visible were snow-covered rooftops, empty white lots, and rails nearly buried. No heat signatures, no movement trails, no foreign objects standing out against Alaska's flat winter white. After hours of flying in bitter, gusting cold, the SAR team's report was recorded clearly, but grimly. No viable sightings from the air, No evidence of the victim or any unusual objects in the entire search grid. With that conclusion, the troopers understood they had just ruled out a huge area while simultaneously facing a brutal truth. If Emily had left the depot in any direction leading into rugged terrain, nature had erased every clue before humans could register it. The troopers returned to the scene the next morning to conduct a critical assessment they knew would directly impact the entire investigation, analyzing the survivability of snow tracks after the previous night's blizzard. This was not a formality, but a specialized technique that Alaska investigators had to employ routinely in winter, where snow could both record truth and obliterate it faster than any other natural force. The troopers began by explaining to each other, and to the younger SAR members, the method of snow tracking, a technique for reading snow evidence based on three main factors: the depth of snow at the moment something moved through it, the compaction of the underlying layer, and wind direction during the relevant time frame. First, depth determined how well a track was preserved. If the snow was thin and dry, footprints would imprint deeply, with sharp edges and a compressed base forming a small crater. But if the snow was deep, soft, and still falling while movement occurred, new layers would immediately cover the prints, blurring or erasing them entirely. The night Emily disappeared, Anchorage recorded continuous heavy snowfall, meaning any surface prints would vanish in a short time. Second, compaction revealed whether a person or object had passed, but to read it, the snow needed several hours to settle. If snow kept falling or strong wind kept drifting powder across the surface, compaction became indeterminate. The troopers observed that the snow around the depot and trails had been blown constantly all night, rendering compaction analysis nearly meaningless. Third, wind direction was the most destructive factor. Wind from the Nike River often carried fine particles that filled depressions, burying footprints or drag marks in minutes. Moreover, when wind shifted, small drifts collided and flattened everything back to the original structure. By measuring the angle of drifted layers and observing snow buildup around fixed objects, the troopers determined that the depot area had been hit by strong winds from two different directions that night. This meant even deep tracks would be wiped clean without leaving any compressed outline beneath. After analyzing those three factors on site, the troopers conducted a small field test. They made a series of footprints in the snow beside the station, then left them for the same length of time as the previous night, while wind still blew hard. Within half an hour, fresh snow had completely covered them. Even the deepest prints were almost gone. Edges softened, grooves disappeared, and with just a few more minutes of wind, the surface returned to perfect smoothness, as if no one had ever walked there. One trooper noted on the evaluation sheet, footprints obliterated in 20-40 minutes, unrecoverable. They also re-examined areas the initial SR teams had searched, especially high-risk spots under overpasses, along the rails, near snow-filled ditches. But after applying snow tracking knowledge, they realized the absence of any depression did not mean no movement had occurred. It only meant the snowfall was too fast and the wind too strong to leave anything behind from the very beginning. Even a drag mark, a crucial indicator in assault or forced movement cases, would have been filled in completely within minutes. An experienced trooper standing beside the tracks looked at the flawless snow and stated flatly that if someone had been dragged across the ice the night before, wind and snow had covered it all in mere dozens of minutes. The analysis continued by checking locations where snow accumulation was uneven, such as corners shielded from wind between walls. If any trace survived, it would be there. But the troopers inspected every nook and got the same result. Fresh snow had filled everything, with no structural or density deviation sufficient to indicate unusual movement. This forced them to reach a heavy but clear conclusion. Whether Emily was forced to walk, collided with something, struggled, or was dragged, all physical evidence related to her movement had been completely erased by the blizzard. The troopers recorded that conclusion in the report as a single line, yet it was the weightiest sentence of the investigation so far. If Emily was forced to move or struggled, All evidence has been obliterated by snow. That line not only illustrated the hopelessness of ground traces, but confirmed that nature, on the night she vanished, had acted like a white shroud over every answer they desperately needed. In the biting cold that penetrated every layer of clothing, the troopers stood staring at the depot area, now perfectly smooth and silent like a blank expanse, and understood that from this point forward, the investigation would have to rely on something other than ground evidence, because the snow had taken away their last chance to follow Emily's footsteps. The troopers shifted the investigation to the possibility that Emily left the depot area by road vehicle, even though initial assessments deemed it unlikely. She had intended to take the train and had no history of hitchhiking or accepting rides from strangers. However, once snow had erased every ground trace, checking vehicles that traveled the Glen Highway became the next mandatory step, because even one driver who saw a lone young passenger on a blizzard night could be the only valuable lead left. The Glen Highway, running north from Anchorage, was the main artery connecting the city to Eagle River, Chugiak, and farther on to Wasilla, where Emily lived with her family. The troopers started by contacting highway checkpoints, gas stations, and 24-hour diners along the route to compile lists of long-haul trucks and buses that passed through the area from late afternoon until dawn on the night Emily disappeared. The review took hours because in 1979 there were no automated logs or traffic cameras. Everything depended on drivers' handwritten notes or station duty logs. The troopers filtered every entry, marking departure times, stops, routes, and the possibility of passengers boarding or alighting near Anchorage Depot. A list of more than 30 trucks and 8 intercity bus routes was compiled. The troopers divided the calls, reaching drivers by landline or radio, sometimes waiting until they pulled into a rest stop to connect. When they reached the first driver, a refrigerated truck hauler, the troopers asked the question they would repeat dozens of times that day. "Did you see a lone young female passenger anywhere along the road near Anchorage last night?" The driver said no. He had driven straight from Anchorage to Palmer and encountered no one because the blizzard was so fierce he had to cut speed nearly in half. Subsequent interviews yielded similar answers. A bus driver on the Anchorage, Eagle River route said his run that night was almost empty, with only 3 passengers, all familiar regulars. When the troopers described Emily, he shook his head. "I remember everyone who got on because it was so cold that every time the door opened the wind made everyone shiver." Another driver heading to Chugiak said he never saw a single pedestrian because the wind was strong enough that no one could stay outside longer than a few minutes without heavy winter gear. The troopers recorded every statement, and they were all the same. Virtually no one was walking along the Glen Highway that night, and certainly no one matching Emily's description. When the last truck on the list had been checked, the result remained unchanged. A few long-haul drivers in Anchorage's northern industrial area recalled seeing a handful of people outside bars or parking lots, but when pressed for details, they all confirmed none were a lone young woman. Not willing to miss even the smallest chance, the troopers expanded interviews to drivers who had stopped at gas stations near the Glen Highway entrances during the estimated time of disappearance. One station owner near Muldoon Road said he had no customers that night because of the blizzard, but remembered a dark-colored pickup passing without stopping. The information was noted but held little value. No one knew where the truck came from or where it was going, and most critically, there was no evidence Emily was connected to it. After interviewing more than 30 drivers, Sayar and the troopers reconvened at the temporary office near the depot to compare notes. A younger trooper asked, "What if Emily was forced into a vehicle, maybe not by a highway driver, but by someone on a side road?" The captain immediately countered that any vehicle leaving the depot area had to pass through at least one of the 2 main exits to reach the highway, and at least one of the people they interviewed should have seen something, especially on a night when the roads were nearly deserted. Yet not a single person had seen a young woman crossing the road, walking along the Glen Highway, or waiting for a ride in heavy snowfall. The troopers' final report was written with cold conciseness. No truck driver, bus driver or long-distance vehicle recorded a passenger or pedestrian matching Emily's description. This led them to a crucial conclusion. If Emily left Anchorage Depot by motor vehicle, that vehicle was not one of the trucks, buses, or any publicly operating road active that night, or she did not leave by road in any conventional way. And while this provided no answer, it eliminated yet another hypothesis, pushing Emily's disappearance deeper into the thick silence left behind by the blizzard. The troopers, after ruling out the possibility that Emily had left Anchorage Depot by long-distance bus or truck, returned to re-examine every witness statement taken at the train station, searching for any detail that stood out beyond the initial scattered information. While reviewing the witness classification chart, they noticed a common thread running through multiple accounts: the presence of a brown Ford Bronco parked near the platform area, close enough to observe passengers, yet not in the usual flow of traffic. 3 witnesses, independently of one another, all recalled seeing this vehicle sometime before or right after the night train arrived. One said he saw the Bronco parked right next to the access road to the overpass, headlights off, but with faint heat still rising from the hood, indicating it had only just stopped. Another remembered the vehicle angled toward the brick wall, in a spot that was not an official parking place and seemed intended to avoid attention. A third witness, a woman waiting for a friend to pick her up, couldn't recall the license plate, but was certain the car had the distinctive boxy shape and a dark brown color that stood out sharply against the white snow. Notably, none of these people remembered seeing the driver get out of the vehicle, and none recalled the Bronco leaving the area by the time they themselves left the station. This repetition gave the impression that the vehicle's presence that night was not random. Still, the Bronco was an extremely common vehicle in Alaska in the late 1970s. A rugged off-road model built for extreme cold, excellent on snow, and the go-to choice for mechanics, laborers, hunters, and anyone who regularly traveled slippery roads. So the sighting of a brown Bronco around Anchorage Depot, taken in isolation, was not unusual. But the consistency across independent witness statements made the detail impossible to ignore. The troopers decided to form a dedicated vehicle investigation subunit with one sole mission: track down every brown Ford Bronco registered in Anchorage, Wasilla, Eagle River, and surrounding areas within a 50-kilometer radius. They began by pulling registration records from the DMV, which at that time existed only on paper and were stored in heavy metal filing cabinets. One trooper was assigned to flip through thick stacks of files, looking for any entry listing a Ford Bronco from model years 1977, 1978, or 1979. The 3 most common years, and the ones whose appearance matched the witnesses' descriptions. It took nearly 2 full days to produce the initial list, more than 3 dozen brown Broncos registered in Anchorage alone, a handful in Wasilla, and fewer still in the sparse residential areas along the Glen Highway. The number didn't surprise the troopers. Broncos were practically the people's car of Alaska back then, but investigating each one individually turned the task into a monumental effort. Unwilling to miss anything, they expanded the search to repair records at local garages. Older Broncos frequently needed heater repairs, tire replacements, or drivetrain work in sub-zero conditions. Troopers visited every shop, from small roadside operations to larger service stations, asking whether any brown Broncos had come in for work in the previous 2 months. Some mechanics vaguely remembered certain owners, but not their names. Many only jotted license plates on scrap paper and threw them away after returning the vehicle. This left the troopers both frustrated and anxious, because they knew their only real lead, if it truly was a lead, could disappear among dozens of scattered records. They therefore intensified the search, using 3 criteria: model year, paint color, and chassis number. But in 1979, VIN systems were not yet standardized the way they would later become, and many older vehicles had faded, peeling, or incorrectly recorded chassis numbers in the registration files. Even so, the troopers painstakingly collected every available VIN from the list and cross-referenced them with repair logs, license plate change records, and even lists of abandoned or privately sold vehicles. Every time they found the slightest match, They logged it on a tracking sheet. Among the Broncos they examined, many belonged to mechanics who drove to job sites and back on fixed schedules. Others were owned by hunters who only used them on weekends or seasonally. Some belonged to people living on the edge of the wilderness who rarely came near Anchorage Depot. However, as the troopers began contacting owners, an interesting detail emerged. 2 witnesses had described the brown Bronco as looking somewhat older and having mud caked on the rear tires, as if it had driven through low-lying or side roads. When they cross-checked the list, the troopers were able to eliminate nearly half the vehicles because their owners' routines had no connection to the train station on the night Emily vanished. Another trooper suggested checking the plate of a Bronco reportedly seen driving near the station entrance that same night, according to a snow sweeper worker. But that worker couldn't recall the plate clearly, only that the vehicle didn't look like it belonged to train passengers because it stayed parked longer than usual. That detail was written down and flagged in red for priority follow-up. Finally, after hours poring over records, the troopers produced a short list of 12 1977-1979 brown Broncos that could plausibly have been in the area around the time Emily disappeared. 12 was still a large number, but small enough to investigate each owner individually. The troopers began prioritizing based on the owner's home locations relative to the station, their regular travel routes, and their occupations. One trooper pointed at the map, circling the area around Anchorage Depot. If that Bronco really is connected, either it lives here or it had a specific reason to be here that night. A large wall map was put up, marking each owner's name, address, vehicle details, and a summary of anything noteworthy from witness statements. When the preliminary list was complete, the troopers realized this was the first time since all physical traces had been erased by snow that they finally had a concrete investigative direction. And although information about a brown Bronco wasn't yet enough to draw any conclusions, it was the first piece that hadn't been swept away by the weather. A tangible thing to hold on to in the harsh blankness that Alaska had left on Emily's disappearance. The discovery of an unusual brown Bronco near Anchorage Depot forced the troopers to expand their investigation to every similar vehicle in the region. And that quickly became one of the most time-consuming phases of the initial inquiry. When they pulled registration records from the DMV and old archives in Anchorage, Wasilla, and Eagle River, the final count made the whole team stop and double-check to make sure they hadn't made a mistake. A total of 41 brown 1977-1979 Ford Broncos were registered across those 3 areas. The number perfectly reflected Alaska at that time, a place where a high-riding, tough vehicle like the Bronco was practically the default mode of transportation for anyone driving through deep snow and icy roads. But out of those 41, only one could be the vehicle seen near the train station the night Emily disappeared, and the troopers had to find which one. They started building a detailed master list, broken down into clear columns: owner's name, home address, occupation, work hours, usual travel routes, and regular destinations. The initial list ran to nearly 100 pages of notes, because many owners lived on the edge of the forest. Others hunted seasonally, and some worked rotating shifts, all of which complicated determining whether they could have been near the station that night. Even so, the troopers persisted, gathering information by phone, house visits, and even asking neighbors to confirm routines, schedules, and habits. Every Bronco on the list was assigned a code by registration area: A for Anchorage, W for Wasilla, E for Eagle River, to make grouping easier. They then narrowed the field by distance from Anchorage Depot. They determined that owners living more than 20 miles away were unlikely to show up there on a blizzard night without a specific reason. That reduced the list to 29 more plausible Broncos. From there, the troopers moved to the critical step, collecting each owner's regular travel patterns to see who might realistically have been near the station the night Emily vanished. People in jobs that required frequent or irregular travel, plumbers, mechanics, utility linemen, light haul drivers, and night shift workers, were placed in a higher risk group, not because they were inherently suspicious, but because their work made odd-hour movement more likely. Owners with fixed schedules or jobs far from Anchorage were marked low priority. The troopers even checked medical records at some local clinics to see if any Bronco owners had visited a medical center in the days around the disappearance, since many might pass the train station when going to the hospital or nearby shopping areas. The data table filled up row by row. An electrician from Eagle River, who always took the Beltway home and never passed the station. A Wasilla hunter who only drove the Bronco on weekends, a railroad technician who was often near Anchorage Depot but had a logged shift elsewhere that night. 3 other Bronco owners lived in South Anchorage, but all 3 insisted their vehicles never left home that night. Though the troopers couldn't fully rely on those statements, they logged them for cross-checking against other sources. After 3 days of filling the table, the troopers finally narrowed it down to a much smaller group, 12 Broncos that could realistically have been at or near Anchorage Depot when Emily was last seen. These 12 owners either lived close to the station, regularly drove routes that passed the area, or worked night shifts that gave them reason to be out at that hour. Within this list were names that caught the troopers' attention, not because the owners showed signs of guilt, but because of coincidental overlap in travel patterns. One owner lived less than a block from the station. Another did overnight deliveries. A third habitually parked near the platform to pick up a coworker. One name in particular was circled in red because the owner could not provide a clear account of his whereabouts that night, offering only a brief "I was home all evening" with no witness to back it up. The troopers drew no hasty conclusions, but they finally had a concrete starting point. The first one since nature had erased every trace in the snow. 12 Broncos, one of which might be the vehicle multiple witnesses saw. And if that vehicle was connected to Emily's disappearance, its owner was now on the list. The troopers had just finished, a list far shorter than the original chaos, yet the only remaining key to the investigation at that moment. The troopers began the interrogation phase of the 12 brown Bronco owners by splitting into smaller teams and fanning out across Anchorage, Eagle River, and Wasilla to visit each home in person, partly to gauge each person's level of cooperation, partly because face-to-face encounters often made vague details clearer through body language, eye contact, and reactions to questions. They started with the 3 owners who lived closest to the station, just a few blocks from Anchorage Depot. At each house, they briefly explained the disappearance, asked whether the person had been near the station that night, and requested a clear alibi. The first, a pipeline maintenance worker, immediately produced his shift log from the company, showing he was on the night shift at a facility more than 5 miles south of the station. The troopers called the company and received confirmation that he had been at work the entire night. The second, a delivery driver, said he was driving to Palmer at that time, and even produced a timed receipt from a stop nearly 40 miles from Anchorage. The troopers radioed the truck stop, and the night clerk confirmed the driver had been there. The third, a middle-aged woman who used her Bronco to get to evening shifts at the local hospital, showed the troopers her time card and had several coworkers verify she was at the hospital all night. All 3 had rock-solid alibis, and their cooperative demeanor allowed the troopers to cross them off the suspect list quickly. Over the following days, the troopers continued knocking on the remaining doors, verifying every alibi against documents, witnesses, and personal schedules to ensure no one was providing false information. One man in Eagle River was renovating his house and had friends over helping that night. 3 friends could confirm he never left until very late. Another owner, a local hunter, kept detailed trip logs and had an entry showing he was at a hunting cabin more than 50 miles from Anchorage. Another was a utility lineman on duty all night repairing storm-damaged power lines. The power company confirmed he was at the repair site during the exact window when Emily disappeared. An older owner in Wasilla said his Bronco had been in the shop for a week with a failed fuel pump. The troopers checked the garage and confirmed the vehicle was indeed there. Another said he had loaned his Bronco to his brother to haul furniture. When the troopers located the brother, he said the vehicle stayed parked in front of his house all night, and neighbors confirmed it. Yet another owner, a woman, said her husband had driven the Bronco to work and returned in the early evening. Security camera footage, one of the few analog cameras in Anchorage at the time, at his workplace, showed him leaving the parking lot at the correct time and never returning. Each time an alibi checked out, the troopers marked the name cleared on the list. They worked meticulously and cautiously, knowing that any mistake could cause them to overlook the very person they were looking for. After multiple rounds of verification, the list of 12 was reduced to exactly one name that still had no clear answer. Howard Mason, who lived in Anchorage not far from the station by road. The troopers arrived at Mason's house on a gloomy afternoon under the gray-blue Alaskan sky that hung like thin fog over the rooftops. Mason's home was in an ordinary residential neighborhood, neither isolated nor crowded, but it looked slightly neglected. Snow unshoveled, walkway cluttered, and a brown Bronco parked under the carport that immediately caught the troopers' attention. Mason answered the door when they knocked, looking a little surprised but not upset. He was a man in his mid-30s, solidly built, with the grease-stained hands typical of a mechanic. When the troopers asked if he had been near Anchorage Depot the night Emily disappeared, Mason replied that he stayed home all evening, working on some things in the garage. But when asked who could verify that, Mason paused noticeably before saying no one, because he lived alone and had no visitors. The troopers noted that hesitation in their notebooks. They asked whether he had driven the Bronco anywhere that night. He answered quickly, no, but the troopers noticed the reply came too fast, as if rehearsed. One trooper asked to see the vehicle, and Mason agreed, leading them to the garage out back. The brown Bronco looked ordinary enough, but the troopers had no way of knowing whether it had left the garage the previous night. Heavy snowfall had erased any tire tracks on the driveway. When they pressed Mason for more details about that evening, he merely shrugged and said, "I work long hours. I don't really keep track of time." His cooperative attitude, combined with the complete absence of an alibi and the vagueness of his answers, made Mason the only person on the list who could not be cleared. The troopers couldn't conclude anything yet. Lacking an alibi does not equal guilt, but in a case where a blizzard had wiped away every physical clue, the fact that Mason was the only one unable to prove where he had been that night made him a critical stopping point in the investigation. As they left Mason's house, the list of 12 Broncos had been whittled down to a single unresolved name, and on Howard Mason's file the troopers wrote a short but significant note that kept him firmly in their sights, unable to provide clear alibi, requires further monitoring. Troopers, after leaving Howard Mason's house with an indefinable floating feeling, immediately returned to the station to expand the investigation into his personal records, because although Mason could not provide an alibi, that alone was not enough to consider him a suspect. They needed to understand the full context of the man's life, habits, and travel history before taking any further step. They started with his residency records. Mason was born in Fairbanks, but moved to Anchorage in 1973 to train as a mechanic, then rented a small house in the eastern part of the city. Address records showed he had changed residences 3 times in 6 years, but all within the Anchorage-Wasilla area, mostly in working-class neighborhoods near repair shops and garages. When reviewing employment records, the troopers found plenty that matched their initial impression of Mason's occupation, a skilled mechanic who had worked at 3 different garages, 2 of which were less than 2 miles from Anchorage Depot. The garage owners described Mason as a hard worker, quiet, not very expressive, but never any trouble. Co-workers said he often stayed late, sometimes repairing vehicles until deep into the night, then drove home along the route that cut across the depot area because it was the shortest way. The troopers noted this because it meant Mason being near Anchorage Depot at night was not unusual, even though he denied being there the night Emily disappeared. Next, they examined Mason's regular travel patterns based on information from colleagues, neighbors, and owners of stores near his home. The results showed Mason followed a fairly predictable routine: mornings at the shop, afternoons home, occasionally driving to Wasilla to visit an old friend, or pick up extra repair jobs. Several neighbors confirmed they had seen Mason drive his Bronco out at night, especially in winter, when he took emergency repair calls or helped acquaintances whose vehicles had broken down on the road. One neighbor who lived directly across from Mason said he had a habit of staying in his garage until late working. His garage light was on almost every winter night. He didn't talk much, but he was always busy with something. This detail both supported and contradicted Mason's statement. Yes, he often stayed home tinkering, but he also frequently went out at odd hours, meaning the alibi "I was home all evening" could be neither confirmed nor disproved based on his lifestyle. The troopers continued by searching legal records to see whether Mason had ever been involved in any conflicts, lawsuits, or disorderly conduct. The result, however, was completely clean. Mason had never been arrested, had no prior convictions or record, no neighbor complaints, no tax debt, no firearms permit applications, and no affiliation with any suspicious organizations. A person with a legal record as spotless as Mason's could not, from a legal standpoint, be detained just for lacking an alibi. The troopers understood that better than anyone, they could not hold or pressure Mason to say more without concrete evidence, something extremely difficult in a case where nature had erased every trace, as in Emily's. They moved on to questioning more of Mason's acquaintances to better understand his personality. One coworker described him as quiet, patient, a bit reserved but not unpleasant, while a former hunting buddy said Mason liked driving to remote forest areas to avoid crowds. None of these accounts were incriminating, but the troopers still recorded them because an introverted personality and solitary trips can sometimes become factors worth considering in missing person investigations. When all the records were compiled, the troopers saw a picture of Mason that was both clear and blurry. Clear in that he had no criminal history, no disruptive behavior, steady employment, and most people spoke well of him. Blurry in that he could not verify his whereabouts on the critical night, regularly drove past the depot area, lived alone, and had no one to account for his evenings. These factors were not enough to charge him, not even enough to place him on the official suspect list, but they made him stand out from the 11 individuals who had been cleared. One trooper wrote in the report, "No priors, no indicators of criminality, but no alibi and travel pattern, consistent with the time of disappearance, cannot hold subject per law." For the first time since the investigation began, the troopers felt they were facing someone who was both ordinary and somehow not entirely consistent with that ordinariness, yet they had no way, and no legal reason, to dig deeper. SAR returned to Chugach State Park for the second search on a gloomy morning when the mountains east of Anchorage were shrouded in thick gray clouds like a heavy curtain, making the space feel heavier and colder than the day before. This was an area the troopers, despite lacking specific evidence, still regarded as one that needed thorough checking because of its rugged terrain, numerous small trails, and snow-buried vegetation that made it easy for a disoriented person to lose all trace. This time, they decided to deploy scent dogs, a search tool they could not use in the initial phase because strong winds quickly scattered any scent. But as the blizzard eased somewhat, though not completely, they hoped the trained dogs would be able to pick up body odor, fabric scent, or any lingering trace beneath the compacted snow. 6 dogs, each handled by 2 personnel, began sweeping from the western edge of Chugach, where multiple trails connected Anchorage to the deeper forest. Those trails, when snow-covered, turned into endless white ribbons that were easy to confuse and especially dangerous for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. SAR spread out in a horizontal line formation, maintaining safe distances between teams so the dogs had enough room to move and sniff. The snow crunched underfoot, but it wasn't loud enough to break the tension that enveloped them as each step took them deeper into the darkening woods. Every time a dog changed behavior, stopping, sniffing hard, or veering onto a different path, the whole team immediately paused to check. But many times, the scent source turned out to be wildlife tracks, or the smell of hikers from days before the heavy snow, making it hard for the troopers to distinguish between what mattered and what didn't. As they pushed deeper into denser forest, the trees grew thicker, snow clinging in layers to low branches, forcing the SAR team to brush it aside by hand to clear a path for the dogs. Fallen trunks and half-buried rocks created obstacles that slowed the search even more. The uneven ground and gentle slopes hidden under snow caused some members to nearly slip, forcing the team to move slower than planned. In the first 2 hours, SAR found nothing but small animal signs: bear, rabbit, fox, and a few pieces of old trash from summer campers. However, near a little-used trail, one dog suddenly pulled hard on its leash, gave a low bark, and buried its nose in a spot at the edge of a snow-covered bush. 2 troopers immediately knelt, brushed away the surface snow, and uncovered a small frozen scrap of fabric, thin as thread from a jacket or wool scarf, that had been crushed by snow. The fabric was dark, but its exact color couldn't be determined because it had faded and absorbed the cold. One trooper placed it in an evidence bag, labeled the code and location, but could not confirm it was related to Emily or just something dropped months earlier. The scent dog reacted mildly at another spot nearby, leading the team to a jagged, ice-covered stump. When the troopers cleared the snow, they found 2 even smaller scraps, one apparently torn nylon, the other so thin it was unidentifiable. None of the items were distinctive enough to link to Emily's clothing, and the troopers knew Chugach was full of such small objects. Hikers, hunters, and tourists could have dropped them over time. Still, they collected everything in evidence bags because experience had taught them that things that seem worthless can sometimes become crucial when cross-referenced later. The deeper they went, the more challenging the terrain became: thick snow on slopes, smooth round rocks hidden under ice, and narrow crevices that forced both people and dogs to move slowly to avoid danger. An experienced trooper constantly reminded everyone to probe with their poles before stepping onto any suspiciously soft or sunken snow, because many soft upper layers concealed voids below that could cause a leg to break through. Despite hours of effort, every dog alert led only to scattered fabric scraps. Nothing was large enough to suggest human presence. There were no footprints because snow had covered everything. No drag marks because the blizzard constantly reshaped the terrain. No personal items like gloves, scarves, or jewelry. One trooper tried digging in areas where the snow appeared more compacted, suspecting a larger object beneath, but found only layers of cold rock. The SR team continued eastward in Chugach, where the terrain opened up but stronger winds interfered with the dogs' tracking. The reactions they hoped for, sudden behavioral changes, prolonged focus on one spot, never materialized. As the sun touched the western mountains and light faded, the forest gradually sank into a cold blue-gray. SAR had to stop because visibility was dropping fast, and in Alaska's mountains, that meant unacceptable risk to the search team itself. They regrouped at the rendezvous point and tallied the results: a few scraps of fabric of unknown origin and dozens of thoroughly checked areas. The team leader wrote in the report, "Complex terrain, deep snow, and strong wind rendered the search prolonged and fruitless. No signs of the victim, no identifiable evidence." That short conclusion captured the entire day's effort. Hours trudging through snow, trees, and icy slopes, only to be met with nature's absolute silence. A silence that pushed Emily's disappearance even further out of reach of any search method. The troopers and SAR team returned to the station with a small but carefully collected bag of evidence from the days spent searching the forest, around the depot, and along the route Emily had taken. Although most of the items, fabric scraps, pieces of nylon cord, a lightly oxidized small metal shard, showed no clear connection to the victim, procedures still required each one to be treated as a potential lead, because in a case where every trace on the snow had been erased, any piece of material that had survived the blizzard might hold an answer, however faint. Inside the temporary storage room, the troopers spread all the evidence across a stainless steel table: 6 fabric pieces recovered from Chugach, most frozen and rotted, 2 nylon threads suspected to be from cold-weather clothing, 1 unidentified thin metal fragment, like tin, partially rusted, and a few other tiny bits the search team couldn't even classify. Each item was placed on its own tray, labeled with code number, discovery location, collection time, and the name of the collector. The 1979 evidence sealing process was not as elaborate as in later decades, but it still demanded absolute precision to prevent cross-contamination or loss. The troopers used special craft paper bags, breathable and non-moisture retaining, to wrap the fabric and fiber samples, then sealed them with tape marked by the signatures of the collector and supervisor. Metal objects were first placed in soft cloth pouches before going into the bags to avoid tearing the packaging. They labeled each item with waterproof ink, noting relation to case not yet determined, because at that time no technology existed to analyze their origins further. Each sealed item was then placed in a moisture-proof box and transferred to the temperature-controlled storage vault to prevent further deterioration. While sealing, a young trooper asked the team leader whether these items would actually help, since they just looked like trash blown into the woods. The leader only shook his head slightly and answered in a voice as cold as it was realistic, "Right now, they're useless. But later, who knows?" That statement reflected not only the technological limitations of 1979, but also the fundamental mindset of investigation: keep everything, even the smallest pieces, so no future opportunity is lost. At that time, when DNA testing wasn't even a practical concept and forensic analysis relied on microscopes, basic optics, or the naked eye, these tiny fabric and material samples were practically unusable for identifying anyone or linking directly to Emily. Despite being collected with care, they remained anonymous objects. No hair, no biological traces, nothing distinctive to compare with anything Emily owned. The troopers knew this, but could not discard them, because in a disappearance where every snow trace vanished within the first few hours, any physical clue could become a link later, even if at the moment it was just worthless debris. After sealing was complete, they carried the entire evidence box down to storage, placed it on the proper shelf, and wrote a stark but accurate line in the log: "Evidence collected, no current value. Retained for future comparison." That note summed up both the disappointment and the tiny remaining hope. Disappointment that what they found couldn't yet answer any question about Emily's disappearance, and hope because, however faint, they were still holding on to the only things nature hadn't managed to completely erase. In a case where weather had held absolute dominance, those snow-crushed fabric scraps became the sole, albeit dim, indication that something had happened in Chugach, something they couldn't yet name but could not ignore. The troopers gathered every investigative file in the small Anchorage station meeting room, covering the tables with note boards, search area maps, witness statements, vehicle lists, and a weather analysis for the night Emily vanished. This was the first time since the investigation began that they paused to assess the whole picture, to see whether any event or chain of data was consistent enough to point them toward a specific suspect. But as they opened each file in turn, the answer became clearer than ever. Nothing formed a continuous thread. Every piece of information stood alone, unable to connect with the rest, as if they were facing a large painting whose colors had all been wiped away by the blizzard, leaving only blank spaces that could not be filled. The witness group provided no clear direction. 2 people saw Emily standing near the light pole. 6 only caught fleeting glimpses through the foggy crowd. 7 heard the wind more clearly than footsteps. No one saw her leave the depot in any specific direction. No one noticed unusual movement. No one remembered seeing her with anyone. What they saw was only the vagueness of a heavy snow night, where human shapes and lights blended together and vanished within minutes. Emily's walking route, when reanalyzed, also failed to narrow the investigation. It was a path anyone could have taken, with bars, homeless people, sparse traffic, dim lighting, and many blind spots where an approach could happen anywhere. No single location stood out as a focal point. No area showed signs of struggle, flight, or dropped items. Everything was buried under the thick snow that nature laid over the city, just minutes after Emily was last seen. Ground searches yielded nothing, from snow-filled ditches and underpasses to bushes and every layer of ice on the rails. Aerial searches became desperate efforts, as helicopters spotted no anomalies along Chugach or the Eklutna Lake area. Natural suspect spots, steep terrain, rock crevices, wind-scoured snowfields were all checked, but showed no signs of life or abandoned belongings. The scent dogs, their slim hope, only led to a few random fabric scraps, small objects that could not be tied to a specific time or person. Forensically, the troopers faced zero. Everything collected was beyond deeper analysis because 1979 technology was too limited. No DNA, no modern micro-testing, no precise material tracing. Those fragments were just frozen bits of matter detached from any context. On the vehicle angle, they got no further either. Trucks and buses never saw Emily, highways recorded no unusual passengers, and everyone present on the main roads that night provided nothing usable. Even the brown Bronco, the most promising lead, gave them no real foothold. 11 of the 12 owners had been cleared with alibis. Only Howard Mason had none, but the absence of physical evidence prevented the troopers from designating him a suspect. He was simply the only one not yet eliminated, not because of any criminal indicator, but because nature had made every possible indicator disappear. When the troopers evaluated the whole, they confronted an unavoidable reality. No consistent event pointed them toward any solid investigative direction. There was no evidence Emily had been forcibly taken. No evidence she left the depot voluntarily. No sign she went by road, rail, or forest trail. No personal belongings left behind. No footprints, no witness saw her move after that moment. Every possibility remained equally open. Vast, vague, and full of gaps. In the summary report, the trooper captain wrote a rare line that was almost an admission of defeat. No physical trace confirming Emily left the depot in any specific direction. All hypotheses unverifiable. When that line was read, the meeting room fell silent. The maps, once densely marked with search circles, now showed only meaningless rings on white. The statements once hoped to open new avenues now lay still like disconnected puzzle pieces that would not fit together. And the investigation, full of effort from the earliest days, began to slow. Not because they were giving up, but because there was nothing left to grasp. The wider they searched, the more blank spaces they encountered. The more data they reviewed, the more they found themselves circling the same point. Emily had vanished from Anchorage Depot as if she had sunk straight into the snow without a trace. And it was at that moment that the prolonged stagnation began, not from lack of effort, but because the case had reached the limit of what humans could do in an Alaska blizzard night in 1979. The nearly 300-page case file was placed on the table on the final morning before the troopers had to make the decision they had been postponing for weeks. Suspend the investigation into Emily Hartman's disappearance. Every report, every search map, every witness statement, and every vehicle list was reviewed one last time in the faint hope that some small detail had been missed. But just like the days before, everything still ended in blank spaces. No identifiable physical evidence, no physical traces, no direction of travel after the last moment a witness saw Emily. No suspect, no chain of events clear enough to continue the investigation. And most importantly, no new leads that could justify opening a specific new line of action. When the meeting ended, the trooper's captain stood up and read aloud the conclusion everyone already knew. Case 79-1142. No actionable evidence. Those words, cold and hollow, were not just an administrative note. They were confirmation that the investigating team had reached the limit of what human effort could achieve in a disappearance whose every trace had been erased by a blizzard in a matter of minutes. In 1979, there was no DNA analysis, no traffic cameras, no centralized alarm systems, no cell phone location data to track. All they had was persistence, boots sinking into snow, and flashlights illuminating the silence of a white blanketed ground. And that silence had given them back exactly nothing. By procedure, a missing person case could only be suspended once every reasonable search and investigative measure had been exhausted and no new information had emerged. The troopers had to write a formal report detailing every step taken, every area searched, the number of witnesses interviewed, the reasons each lead was ruled out, and the conclusion that the case could not progress without new evidence. The report was sent up the chain of command, stamped, and a copy filed under unsolved cases. For Emily's case, the file number remained 79 is 1142. The records clerk carried the thick stack of documents down to the basement storage room of the trooper's post, where thousands of other case files lay silent inside old metal cabinets. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the cold case numbers taped to each spine. File 79 is 1142 was slid into the drawer marked December 1979, pushed behind dozens of lesser incidents. When the cabinet door closed, the dry metallic clang sounded like the final period placed on an unfinished story. Emily Hartman's disappearance, though unresolved, officially became a cold case, a dormant file that would only be reopened if new information surfaced or future technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence that could not be deciphered at the time. The troopers left the storage room with the heavy feeling they had experienced many times in their careers, but this time the helplessness ran deeper. Emily had vanished right in front of the city, on a winter night when everyone was huddled indoors against the cold, and not a single trace had followed her into the darkness. No one knew how she left the depot. No one knew whom she met. No one knew what happened. Only the snow, still falling outside, thicker and quieter with each passing minute, had been the sole witness. And snow never speaks. With the file shelved, the Emily Hartman investigation quietly closed, sinking beneath the troopers' building alongside thousands of other cases, waiting for something no one could be sure would ever come. A new clue, an unexpected break, or an opportunity from the years ahead. But in 1979, 1142 officially became a cold case. A crack that could not be mended in the memory of everyone who had worked the case and never found the way back to the place where Emily disappeared. It took more than 3 decades after File 79-1142 was pushed into the cold basement storage of the trooper's post for Emily Hartman's disappearance to be looked at again. And that chance did not come from a new statement, new evidence, or a new witness, but from what seemed like a completely routine administrative change, the Alaska State Troopers program to digitize all old records. In April 2014, after the agency received federal funding to modernize its archives, thousands of dusty paper files from the 1950s through the late 1980s were trucked to the newly built Digital Storage Center in Palmer. The project's goal was to scan everything: short reports, handwritten letters, crime scene photos, sketches, so the information would be preserved before the paper rotted away. Every day, technicians sat at industrial scanners, carefully removing file covers, smoothing each page, feeding it through the machine, tagging it with metadata, then returning everything to its box. File 79-1142 sat in a box from 1979, labeled in scrawled handwriting, Hartman, missing person. To the people working the project, it was just one of hundreds of unsolved disappearances from that decade. No special police notes, no striking evidence, no pages flagged in red like violent crime cases. In the system catalog, it was simply classified, closed, no evidence. A young technician named Daniel Grady was assigned that box on a Tuesday afternoon when sunlight streaming through the glass wall made the dust in the scanning room float like soft fog. Daniel had been doing this job for 8 months, carefully but mechanically, expecting nothing more than to meet his weekly quota. He opened Emily's file, glanced at the first few pages, the missing person report, the initial route map, the witness list, and the faded notes from the final meeting before suspension. When he reached the back, where loose documents were usually kept, he found a thin brown envelope marked "Additional Photos, Depot." The writing was faint, and the ink bled a little, so he assumed it held the usual black and white crime scene prints. But when he opened it, he immediately knew something was different. Instead of standard prints, inside were 3 old Polaroids, their plastic edges yellowed with age. One was creased at the corner, The other two were fairly intact. Even more noticeable, the back of each photo bore a date stamp. When Daniel looked closely at the pale blue ink stamped along the bottom edge, he frowned. The stamp read 02DEC 78. Yet Emily's case was from November 1979. A discrepancy of more than a year. He turned the photos over again, wondering whether someone had misfiled them or whether they belonged to another case entirely. But the envelope was stapled firmly into the section Depot, Night of Disappearance, meaning that when the file was originally assembled, someone had placed them with material directly related to Emily's case. To be sure, Daniel held the photos closer to the strong light. The first showed a corner of Anchorage Depot from the left, snow falling, sodium lights, casting a hazy glow on the icy ground. The second was taken from the overpass, looking down onto the perron, where passengers waited for the night train. But the third made him pause longer. In the center of the frame, beneath the third light pole, stood the figure of a young woman, dark coat, small build, hands holding her bag straps, head slightly tilted, as if looking toward the tracks. The image was blurry. Nighttime Polaroids always struggled with light, but the side profile was clear enough. Hair tied back, young face, body type matching Emily's description in the file. Daniel flipped the photo over again and stared at the 02DEC 78 stamp. One question hit him immediately. If the photo was taken in 1978, why did the girl in it match the victim, who disappeared in November 1979, so eerily well? Or had the year on the date stamp simply been set wrong? That was entirely possible. Polaroid date stampers from that era used simple spring mechanisms, and many self-service photo booths forgot to advance the year wheel at the start of a new year. Daniel laid the three photos side by side and compared the angles to the depot map in the file. Everything matched the witness descriptions: the third light pole, the height of the roof overhang, the slanted strip of snow on the platform stones, the blurred crowd at the edge boarding the train. Most importantly, the scene was unmistakably Anchorage Depot on a snowy night. And according to the investigation file, there was only one snowy night the troopers cared about: the night Emily vanished. Daniel took the photos to the specialized scanner for enlargement, holding the edges carefully so the aged plastic wouldn't tear. When the high-resolution image appeared on the computer screen, he could see the snow piling against the girl's boots more clearly, the light from the pole reflecting off her collar, and even, to the left of the frame, a parked vehicle a few yards away. Boxy shape, dark color, very likely a late 1970s Bronco. Anyone looking at the picture would understand: forgotten evidence, wrongly dated, mistakenly tucked into the file for over 30 years. Daniel immediately entered his discovery into the system: possible image of victim, depot, night of disappearance. Date stamp inconsistent, potential misprint. He knew this needed to go straight to a supervisor. For a cold case, a single photograph taken at the exact moment the victim was last seen could be the starting point for an entirely new investigation. But at that moment, in the quiet scanning room of 2014, Daniel only knew one thing. After 35 years, lying silent in storage, Case 79-1142 had just taken its first heartbeat again. From an old Polaroid, someone in 1979 had overlooked. The Alaska State Troopers Digital Forensics Center received the three Polaroids the very next morning, and within hours they were loaded into modern image analysis systems that did not exist in 1979. The technicians opened the third photo, the one showing the girl beneath the third light pole, and immediately began the most critical step: running it through AI noise reduction and high-resolution background restoration. Nighttime Polaroids were always heavily grainy: large light specks, poor contrast, and dark areas. Dead with no recoverable data, but 2014 technology allowed a four-step pipeline: grain restoration, light reconstruction, contrast balancing, and low-light detail enhancement. As the denoising algorithm ran, the originally blurry image began separating into layers. Light from the pole became clearer. The edges of the girl's coat sharpened, and the background, which had previously been swallowed in darkness, started revealing faint outlines. One technician zoomed into the area to the right and behind the girl, where the naked eye saw only a black smudge. As the system sharpened the dark regions, that smudge slowly resolved into a clearer shape. A human figure standing roughly 4 to 5 steps behind Emily, slightly offset to the rear and left. The Polaroid did not capture a face, but when brightness was increased, the outline of shoulders and posture became unmistakable, not mere noise. The man stood upright, head slightly lowered, hands at his sides, body angled a little toward Emily, as if watching her or waiting. Another technician isolated the silhouette and fed it into a backlit image restoration system. Using algorithms that rebuilt edges from residual light signals, they gradually revealed details of a thick, high-collared men's coat with broad shoulders, typical of mechanics or outdoor laborers in the late 1970s. Body measurements were analyzed. Estimated height, 5'11" inches to 6'1", solid build, pronounced upper body muscle. All of it made it impossible for the troopers to ignore the coincidence, because in the 1979 file, only one tall man regularly seen near the depot at night had no alibi for the night. Emily disappeared. Howard Mason. Still, they needed science, not hunch. A technician pulled the original 1979 composite sketch, an uncertain drawing based on vague witness descriptions showing only a strong jaw and broad forehead, and digitized it. They fed it into the facial matching system using overall body shape rather than facial details, since the Polaroid lacked resolution for facial structure. After entering data from the silhouette posture, height, shoulder width, body ratios, head outline, the system ran the comparison. The result appeared as a percentage chart. 80% match with the 1979 witness composite. For a nighttime Polaroid, 80% was astonishing. A technician immediately called the captain. There's a male figure standing right behind the girl. Body matches the original composite. They pushed the enlargement further into the area, where only a few weak bright pixels remained from the pole's light. When the AI rebuilt contrast, another detail emerged. The vehicle parked under the overpass, previously just a meaningless dark block, now clearer, square hood, raised body, large wheel wells. When the classic vehicle shape recognition filter was applied, the system returned Ford Bronco 1977, 1979, 84% confidence. The three technicians looked at each other. No one spoke, but everyone understood the weight of that coincidence. They cross-referenced the vehicle's position in the photo with witness statements: brown Bronco parked near the perron. Lights off, body angled slightly toward the wall. Everything lined up so perfectly that were it not for the wrong date stamp, one could believe the picture was taken the exact moment Emily stood under the third light pole. To be certain, they examined the date stamp using spectroscopy, analyzing ink, aging, and color layering. Results showed the ink was from that era, but the year wheel on the stamper had very likely been set wrong or slipped. A common documented error in many Anchorage photo booths of the late 1970s. When the three pieces of information, the male silhouette, the Bronco shape behind it, and the position-matching witness accounts, were combined in the same data frame, the troopers realized this was no longer a merely overlooked photo. This was the only surviving Polaroid that might have captured the exact moment Emily Hartman was last seen, and simultaneously captured the person standing behind her. The final image analysis report stated clearly, AI-enhanced Polaroid reveals unidentified male silhouette standing approximately 4 or 5 feet behind the victim. Shape and proportions align with 1979 composite at 80% similarity. Vehicle and background consistent with Ford Bronco, potentially critical evidence. In that brightly lit tech room, a Polaroid once thought worthless had opened the door back to the snowy night of 1979, the night Emily disappeared. And for the first time in 35 years, Case 79-1142 was no longer an absolute blank. The troopers immediately reopened every record related to Howard Mason after the Polaroid analysis showed the male figure behind Emily matched the 1979 composite at a high probability. More than 30 years had passed, and tracking a person after that long required combining modern administrative databases with whatever scraps remained in the old paper files. The first residency search showed Mason currently living in Fairbanks, more than 300 miles north of Anchorage. Tax records, professional licenses, and address history confirmed he had moved there in the late 1990s after a string of short-term jobs at small garages in Anchorage and Wasilla. Fairbanks offered harsh winters, long seasons, and plenty of work fixing off-road vehicles, a place where Mason could blend into a working-class community without drawing attention. Current vehicle records showed Mason now owned a fairly recent pickup, registered in Fairbanks, nothing connected to the brown Bronco that had put him on the suspect list in 1979. When they traced the ownership history backward, the 1978 Bronco was shown deregistered in 1984, with no official record of sale through DMV. That sent the troopers back to the old files. The original 1979 investigation noted Mason confirmed owning a 1978 brown Ford Bronco at the time of Emily's disappearance, and that vehicle was the reason he was among the 12 owners questioned. The 1979 report also recorded Mason claiming he did not drive anywhere that night, yet he provided no witness or objective proof. Cross-checking the 1979 DMV file revealed a small note: vehicle last inspected 1 month before incident, condition fair, no recorded mechanical issues. That confirmed Mason's Bronco was fully operational that night, despite his vague statements about its condition. To dig deeper, the troopers began tracing the Bronco through the old garages where Mason had worked. Most repair records had been lost or destroyed, but one garage still had a mechanic's logbook from the winter of 1979-1980, containing a short entry: Mason, check heater unit, Bronco 78. No exact date, only an estimated week and month, but it proved Mason was still routinely using the Bronco at least a few weeks after Emily vanished. Even more interesting was the note beside it: customer waited outside, left quickly. It could mean nothing, but placed next to the Polaroid showing a dark Bronco in the same frame as the male figure behind Emily, the troopers could not dismiss the coincidence. They continued reviewing Mason's personal file from 1979. In his initial interview, he insisted he stayed home all evening working in the garage, but the original investigators had quietly noted garage showed no signs of recent activity, no fresh gasoline smell, no tools laid out. A detail that meant little at the time now carried more weight when the Polaroid placed a man in the exact spot witnesses described the night Emily disappeared. When they examined Mason's movement history over the decades, they found he had almost never left Alaska, had never lived outside the state for any significant period, and always worked in automotive repair or places that serviced old vehicles, an environment perfectly familiar to someone who once drove a 1978 Bronco and knew how it handled in ice and snow. More importantly, Mason had lived alone for most of his adult life. No close family, no intimate friends, a social profile that raised no direct red flags but made verifying alibis in any situation extremely difficult. When all the modern and historical data were placed side by side, the troopers wrote in their 2014 report, Mason no longer owns the Bronco. However, 1979 records confirm he drove a brown 1978 Bronco, no alibi. Inconsistencies in original statement, the overlap between the silhouette and the Polaroid, the old composite, and Mason's ownership of the exact type of vehicle visible in the photo could no longer be called coincidence. For the first time since 1979, the name Mason was no longer just an item to be cleared from a list. It had become the focal point from which the entire case had to be re-examined from the beginning. The summer of 2013 crashed down on Alaska in a way the people living near Lake Eklutna had rarely seen: brutal sunshine, abnormally high temperatures, and the perennial ice around the lake's edges starting to crack and melt faster than any weather forecast had predicted. Cold water ran in long streaks across the gray rock, exposing patches of earth and terrain features that had only been visible at the very end of autumn for decades. Hikers, joggers, and fishermen around the lake kept posting pictures on local forums of bare shoreline strips no one had ever seen before. For most Anchorage, Eagle River residents, it was just a sign of weird weather. But for the troopers, Lake Eklutna was one of the areas that had been searched during the Emily case, and every time the ice retreated unusually far, the place deserved another look. In the afternoon of July 29th, a middle-aged man walking the East Side Trail, poorly maintained and usually ice-covered almost year-round, stopped when he spotted a strange glint coming from the freshly exposed ground. He bent down, brushed away the wet mud and gravel, and jerked back when he realized it wasn't an aluminum can or some tourist trash. It was a small flat metal piece about the size of 3 fingers, lightly rusted but still showing raised edges that the naked eye could tell came from machinery or a personal item. He poked it with a stick, felt it was solid, and wedged under shallow tree roots, as if it had been there a very long time. Not daring to dig further himself, he immediately pulled out his phone and called Alaska State Troopers, reporting that he had found something that doesn't look like it belongs in nature in an area the search teams had swept in 1979. The call was routed to the nearest trooper post, and just 36 minutes later, 2 troopers and a mobile forensic technician were on scene. They asked the caller to step aside, quickly cordoned off the area with yellow tape, and expanded the restricted radius to 20 meters to prevent any contamination. Before touching the object, they photographed the entire site from multiple angles, documenting position, light direction, mud depth, and clear signs the lake level had dropped dramatically compared to previous years. One trooper carefully used a small metal tool to clear the mud around it, revealing the rest of the object. When they lifted it from the ground, they saw it wasn't just anonymous scrap. The edge had the structure of a metal frame section or accessory from a personal item, possibly from a bag, a zipper pull, or outdoor gear. What really caught their attention was the metal surface. Despite oxidation, it still showed a darker streak like light burn or heavy friction. The kind of mark that only appears when metal has scraped against something else with significant force. The forensic tech immediately placed the object on a tray, using rubber-tipped forceps to avoid scratches or fingerprints, then sealed it in an evidence bag. The abnormal heat was drying the mud fast, so they had to work quickly to avoid altering the surface. While carefully digging around the spot, the troopers found a few more signs. Small stones shifted at odd angles, layered arc-shaped cracks, and especially a narrow groove running nearby, possibly caused by fast-flowing water or possibly by something being dragged and then buried for years. None of it was enough to confirm a connection to Emily's case, but the location, Lake Eklutna shoreline, an area once considered a possible accident or concealment site in winter, made the discovery significant. The troopers noted in the scene report, unidentified metallic object, likely long-term burial, possibly exposed due to abnormal thaw. They continued searching the wider area by eye and probe, but found no second object. GPS coordinates were immediately updated to record the exact position relative to the current waterline for comparison with the 1979 lake maps. The difference in shoreline was nearly 3 meters, extremely rare. While collecting surrounding mud and soil samples for sediment age analysis, the troopers said nothing. But everyone understood this abnormal melt wasn't just a weather event, it had just revealed an object that might have lain undisturbed under ice for more than 3 decades. And if that object was found in one of the exact areas searched for Emily, it could be the first piece of a secret buried since the winter of 1979. A piece nature had finally decided to give back. The troopers returned to Lake Eklutna the next morning with far more advanced forensic gear than anything available in 1979, determined to collect every trace the unusual thaw might still be yielding. The lake, though still dotted with jagged white ice, had dropped another several dozen centimeters overnight, exposing a long strip of gravelly shore like an old scar the ice cover had been peeled away from. The forensic team set up a temporary tent at the water's edge and established a semicircular search grid centered on the metal object's discovery point. They placed reflective stakes and laid tarps to avoid stepping on the survey area. The weather was still abnormally sunny. The heat made water evaporate slowly but started crusting the mud, creating better conditions for collecting samples without distortion. The metal piece from the day before was placed on a shallow examination table under strong white light for a second look. Once the outer mud was cleaned with specialized tools and soft brushes, more details emerged. Along one edge was a layer of brown paint, flaking off in patches, beneath it rust-bloated metal, showing it had once belonged to a larger painted object. The brown paint wasn't a natural lake environment color, it was manufactured paint, very similar to the shades used on off-road vehicles from the late 1970s, especially 1977-1979 Broncos. A technician leaned in close and ran a handheld spectrometer over the paint. The device returned results: iron oxide pigment levels and organic binder matching the dark brown automotive paint common in the late 70s. One trooper glanced at the forensic lead. No one spoke, but they were all thinking the same thing: brown Bronco. The detail tied to witness statements and the Mason file, now turning up near Lake Eklutna, an area calculated as high risk in Emily's disappearance. But they had to keep collecting everything the melt might be giving up. The troopers swept the grid with long probes and handheld metal detectors. When a detector gave a soft beep, a technician knelt and excavated thin layers, according to protocol. They recovered two smaller metal fragments, coin-sized, heavily rusted and shapeless. On one, though, a faint brown paint trace remained in a corner. A trooper angled a penlight across the edge and saw the paint ran in a curved strip, like a door frame or side panel. All pieces were placed in separate trays, photographed with scale rulers, and sequentially numbered. A few meters farther into softer mud, they uncovered something else partially exposed: a dark brown leather strip about 14 centimeters long, badly decomposed with inner fibers showing like rotted wood. The surface was wrinkled and torn in places, but the upper edge still had a line of stitching that looked like the border of a bag strap or carry handle. A specialist lifted it with tweezers, placed it in its own tray, and immediately noted decay level, tear patterns, and water saturation. What held the trooper's attention was the leather color, dark brown, almost exactly matching the description of the bag Emily was carrying the night she vanished. A minor detail in the file many younger troopers had never read, but anyone who reviewed the 1979 documents remembered clearly. Still, no one was allowed to jump to conclusions. Personal items wash up around Alaskan lakes all the time, especially with long winters and heavy summer outdoor activity. But the location, almost exactly the shoreline section helicopters had overflown in 1979, made the coincidence heavier. Following 2013 evidence collection standards for natural environments, everything had to be treated as degradable: no sealed plastic bags, which can grow mold, only breathable craft paper with silica gel packets, and special vented outer bags. Each item got its own bag to prevent cross-contamination. The brown painted metal went in first, then the two small fragments, and finally the leather strip. In the tent, technicians labeled every bag with ID code, GPS coordinates, preliminary description, and collector's name. Everything was then packed into a sealed transport box, lined with impact foam, to keep evidence pristine until it reached the main Anchorage crime lab. Before leaving the scene, the troopers took a full panoramic photo series documenting where each item was found, including newly exposed soil layers, relation to the trail, and mud depth. An older trooper stared at the misty lake surface and wrote in his notebook, "Without this freak hot summer, everything down there would have stayed under ice for decades more." It wasn't just fact, it was acknowledgement that nature, which had hidden every trace of the night Emily disappeared, was now starting to give tiny pieces back as if the 2013 heat had cracked open a seam, letting people peer into a place that for over 30 years had known only ice and silence. The rusted metal scraps, flaking brown paint, and rotted leather strip didn't yet mean anything definitive. But each one, small enough that someone else might call trash, carried potential weight. They could belong to anyone, or they could belong to one person. The person who vanished from the Anchorage depot in the winter of 1979. And the troopers, for the first time in decades, knew they had just recovered the first physical evidence the wind and snow hadn't erased. The Anchorage Crime Lab received the evidence box from Lake Eklutna that same afternoon, and within hours technicians began detailed analysis of each item under modern forensic standards. Though the items had spent over 30 years buried in ice, the team treated them as potentially case-defining because the discovery context and the abnormal thaw made every fragment valuable. They started with the most important piece, the larger brown-painted metal fragment. Under a high-resolution optical microscope, the remaining paint showed a two-layer structure, top-coat iron oxide pigment over a cold-resistant organic primer, typical of late 1970s automotive paint. A subsample went into an infrared spectrometer for exact chemical composition. When the graph appeared, the room went quiet for a few seconds. The spectrum matched almost perfectly the reference sample from 1978 Ford Broncos, the exact vehicle Mason owned, the vehicle witnesses described, and the vehicle the AI reconstruction had placed in the restored Polaroid. For certainty, they compared it against three other period paints: early 80s pickup paint, recreational boat paint, and industrial fuel container paint. All three were ruled out. Only the 1977-1979 Bronco, especially the 1978 model, matched. Still, the troopers knew matching paint wasn't direct proof. Hundreds of Broncos had been on Alaska roads back then, but the discovery location, Lake Eklutna shoreline, a high-risk zone, made the result impossible to dismiss. Next were the two smaller fragments. Under the microscope, both showed slight curvature, as if once part of a larger frame, not random debris. One still had a razor-thin brown paint trace at the edge. The same spectral analysis, identical pigment binder and degradation profile. The technician wrote, small fragments highly likely from same brown-painted metal structure, consistent with 1978 Bronco paint. An observing trooper suddenly remembered a forgotten detail from the 1979 file. Mason's vehicle registration had never been confirmed active past 1984. It was simply marked canceled 1984. No one knew if the Bronco was sold, scrapped, or abandoned somewhere remote. And now brown-painted Bronco parts were surfacing from Lake Eklutna. And area helicopters had searched but couldn't see beneath the ice, putting the hypothesis that Mason's Bronco sank there on the table for the first time. But they needed more. The decomposed leather strip went under the scanning electron microscope on a sterile tray with dehumidification. The collagen fibers were shredded, but the weave pattern was clear enough, not shoe or jacket leather, but the type used for purse straps or small tool carriers. When they pulled the 1979 file for comparison, they found an almost forgotten reference item, a dark brown leather fragment found near the Anchorage depot days after Emily vanished, deemed worthless at the time due to lack of analysis technology and unknown ownership. The old report read, leather strap fragment, unverified, likely unrelated. When the old fragment was retrieved and run through modern equipment, the match was immediate: color, fiber pattern, thickness, and edge stitching all aligned with the lake sample. Similarity was recorded at 78%, extremely high for evidence that had spent over 30 years in mud and ice. One technician said quietly, if these two leather pieces are from the same bag or item, the question isn't whether they're connected, it's how the first ended up near the depot and the second floated all the way to Eklutna. Every trooper in the lab understood what that meant. Someone had taken Emily or her belongings toward Lake Eklutna that night or shortly after. And if that happened, the only vehicle capable of moving a victim through deep 1979 winter snow was Mason's Bronco. The final analyst summary read, "Metal and paint evidence highly probable from 1978 Bronco. Leather fragment matches type, found near Anchorage Depot 1979. Geographic and melt flow context insufficient to explain presence at lake without mechanical transport involvement." The troopers took the report, read every line carefully, then looked at the wall map, the route from Anchorage Depot to Lake Eklutna, a route a four-getted Ford Bronco could handle even in deep winter, especially with a driver who knew the terrain, exactly like Mason. When the analysis was complete, an unofficial conclusion formed in the briefing room: the evidence from Lake Eklutna was no longer random metal and old leather. It was part of a story, buried under ice for over 30 years. A story that might involve the 1978 Bronco Howard Mason once owned. And from that moment the troopers knew they were no longer facing a dormant cold case. They had the first strong enough clue to move Case 79-1142 into a new phase. The Anchorage Crime Lab moved to the most critical step in the Eklutna evidence chain, attempting to recover the VIN, the unique vehicle identification number, from the rusted metal pieces pulled from the newly melted ice. Though the fragments were small, deformed, and heavily oxidized, the technicians knew that on any 1977-1979 Bronco, certain key components, door frames, hinges, inner panels, or frame trim, always carried stamped or partial VIN markings for repair and verification purposes. If there was even a slim chance, the only way to read stampings erased by time and ice was laser scanning combined with 3D surface reconstruction, technology that simply didn't exist in 1979. They began with minimal mechanical cleaning of the largest fragment, removing only loose mud and debris, never touching deep rust that might contain the microscopic VIN indentations. The sample was locked into a vibration-isolated table, and the laser head was adjusted to scan in extremely narrow slices at high resolution. The laser read reflectance and recorded surface deviations at the micrometer level. The monitor began building a 3D topographic map where every depth difference appeared as a different color. At first, it showed only rust pits and erosion, like weathered rock. But as the system increased sensitivity and algorithmically stripped away surface rust layers in reverse, the random scratches and dents started forming patterns, straight lines, uniform grooves. A technician zoomed into the left corner of the 3D model and saw it first, a horizontal indentation of even thickness, exactly where manufacturers stamped secondary VIN sections on metal parts. The room held its breath as the computer rebuilt the original metal layer beneath. Rust layers were peeled back digitally, 1, 2, 3, and directly underneath appeared faint, raised impressions, invisible to the naked eye. Cold-stamped marks from late 1970 as industrial dyes. Each character was only 0.01 to 0.03 mm deep, but retained basic shape. The system switched to character recognition mode and began comparing against Ford's 1977-1979 Bronco VIN tables. The digits emerged slowly, like an echo from the past, first a U, then 5, then the long string that followed, sunken stamped characters reconstructed by the laser. The technician read them aloud and wrote on the whiteboard behind him, U5HLQ1749. The lab fell completely silent, except for the hum of cooling fans. A trooper immediately opened the digitized DMV archive and entered the partial sequence. Seconds later, the system returned a hit. The VIN belonged to a dark brown 1978 Ford Bronco registered in Anchorage in 1978 to owner Howard Allen Mason. No one spoke for several seconds. A technician double-checked the old DMV record, correct year, correct recorded paint color, correct registration date, correct standard Ford Bronco model. Another trooper pulled the original 1979 investigation file and found the Mason interview page. There, in Trooper Carlson's faded handwriting, vehicle owned at time, Ford Bronco 78, color brown. The metal pieces lifted from the ice weren't just painted scraps, they were remains of that exact Bronco. For absolute certainty, the lab rescanned the entire sample from a different angle. Reran the rust layer reconstruction algorithm, same VIN, not a single character different. After more than 30 years under Lake Eklutna ice, Mason's 1978 Bronco had left its undeniable identity on a piece of metal pulled from the lake bed. A technician wrote in the report, VIN match, 100%, part consistent with frame stamping location. Belongs to Mason's 1978 Bronco. The troopers standing around the analysis table each understood what they were witnessing. Mason's vehicle, the suspicion that never had enough evidence to pursue in 1979, had been located in one of the key search zones they had been powerless to examine beneath the ice back then. This was no longer coincidence, no longer speculation, no longer the unclear feeling from Mason's statements 40 years earlier. The Bronco that disappeared after 1984 had now surfaced piece by piece from the lake bottom. And with a perfect VIN match, the question was no longer where did that Bronco go, but why was it at Lake Eklutna? A question that could only lead to one possibility. Mason's vehicle had been exactly where it never should have been. The Anchorage crime lab moved to a step that in 1979 had been impossible. DNA testing on the decomposed leather strip recovered from Eklutna Lake. Even though the evidence had spent more than 30 years under ice, the technicians still hoped biological traces might survive on the inner surface of the leather, the side less exposed to water, light, and abrasion, and more likely to retain epithelial cells or sweat from whoever had handled it. The first thing they did was separate the leather layers with a microsurgical blade in a completely sterile environment, cutting along the edge where the stitching threads were still attached. The outer layer had almost completely rotted away, but the innermost layer, though waterlogged and discolored, still retained collagen fibers in a condition that could be processed. A forensic technician gently swabbed the inner surface of the strip with a sterile cotton swab, then placed the sample into a specialized DNA extraction tube. The method used was low molecular weight DNA extraction, designed specifically to recover fragmented gene sequences. The centrifuge ran at low speed through multiple cycles to collect even the tiniest fragments. The initial result made the whole team double-check. The recovered DNA was not long enough for a full profile, but it was sufficient for a partial analysis. The kind used to match repeat segments against existing databases. One technician whispered, "This is already lucky. Getting DNA from leather that rotted is rare." When the DNA sample was run through Alaska's CODIS system, no one expected much. Emily had never had a medical DNA profile, and the troopers had no idea whose leather it was. Yet within 6 minutes of running the partial match, the system returned a hit. The partial DNA was a strong match to a sample from Howard Allen Mason, collected in 2003 during a workplace injury lawsuit after he hurt his hand in a Fairbanks garage. At that time, Alaska law required a DNA sample for identity verification and long-term treatment. No one in the lab spoke for a moment. A technician reran the analysis, then ran it a third time with a different comparison algorithm. Same result. The DNA from the inner surface of the leather strip matched Mason's profile at 94%, an extremely high probability for evidence degraded over 3 decades. The automated report flashed on the screen. Partial DNA match, Howard A. Mason, strength high, statistical confidence 1 in 74 million. At that point, the only question was no longer whether Mason had ever touched that leather strip, but why his DNA was on a strip found at Eklutna Lake, next to a Bronco part whose restored VIN exactly matched the vehicle registered to him. The troopers immediately called an emergency meeting. The evidence report was placed on the table, a metal fragment painted Bronco brown, a fully restored VIN matching Mason's registered vehicle, a leather strip bearing Mason's DNA, and a geographic context that aligned with a plausible route for removing Emily from the Anchorage depot the night she vanished. For the first time in nearly 35 years, the scattered pieces of data, witness sightings of a Bronco, Mason's lack of alibi, the restored Polaroid showing a man's silhouette behind Emily, and now DNA, were falling into the shape of a single map. The trooper's captain wrote in the report forwarded up the chain, Case 79-1142 reclassified, active major crimes investigation. Evidence strongly suggests involvement of Howard Allen Mason. The missing person file of Emily Hartman, thought to have gone cold in 1979, was elevated to intensified investigation with top priority. And in Anchorage, no one on the team would ever forget that moment, the moment a rotted scrap of leather from Eklutna Lake spoke what the snow had tried to bury for decades. The Alaska State Troopers Geographic Analysis Center was mobilized immediately after the Eklutna Lake evidence, and DNA results showed that Case 79-1142 was no longer a dormant file, but an active criminal investigation. Their task: reconstruct every plausible route Howard Mason could have driven on the night of November 29, 1979. The night Emily disappeared, using weather data, late 1970 subway maps, old road infrastructure, and archived winter traffic routes stored in the state's records. The work began by pulling detailed meteorological maps from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, hourly wind speeds and directions, snowfall amounts, icing zones, and roads rendered impassable by that night's blizzard. Next, the GIS team retrieved 1979 Anchorage, Eklutna snow depth maps, snow thickness by sector, the ability of vehicles to cross ice crusts, road slopes at the moment wind shifted. They even pulled compacted snow data from the Glen Highway taken from old traffic telex and fax reports that noted locations of stuck vehicles, minor accidents, and black ice sections. Once all the data was loaded, a 3D model spanning many square kilometers appeared on the screen. Anchorage at night in a blizzard, with snow layers moving in real time, an accurate simulation of what a 4x4 Bronco would have faced if it left the Anchorage depot between 22:30 and 23:10. The next step was to input the vehicle parameters: a 1978 Ford Bronco, rear-wheel bias with selectable 4WD, deep-tread tires. This was the exact vehicle Mason owned at the time, and that vehicle, not some generic one, was simulated to see where it could realistically have gone that night. The GIS system ran a least resistance winter route algorithm that calculates the most feasible path in deep snow based on snow compaction, vehicle load-bearing capacity, road incline, and risk of loss of control on ice. The results displayed as a web of faint glowing lines, each a possibility. Only 3 routes were highlighted in red, the only 3 routes a Bronco 4x4 could have navigated in that heavy snowfall. When the model was zoomed in, everyone in the room went quiet. All 3 routes passed through the Anchorage depot and merged onto the Glen Highway at the exact spot where witnesses had described seeing a brown Bronco parked at an angle beneath a streetlight. But the more critical layer appeared next. The GIS unit overlaid a dataset of historic snowdrift patterns, 1979 wind-driven snow accumulation, recorded by NOAA, on a grid map. These patterns showed where wind piled snow into large drifts and where it scoured the road clear. When this layer was applied, the system automatically eliminated most of the routes. Any Bronco attempting them would have been stuck or slid off the road. In the end, only one route remained in dark green, the highest probability route, according to the GIS model. That route ran straight north from the Anchorage depot area, merged onto the Glen Highway, then turned onto a side road leading to the western shore of Eklutna Lake, exactly where the metal fragments and leather strip had been found in July 2013. A GIS technician added the 1979 traffic incident layer, accidents, stuck vehicles, snowplow callouts, and a small red dot appeared roughly 1 kilometer from the lakeshore discovery site. Vehicle stuck, unidentified 4x4, reported by snowplow operator, the 30th of November 1979, 3:10 a.m. The report was noted, unable to reach due to blizzard, and no follow-up occurred, because fresh snow buried the area by morning. But that red dot aligned almost perfectly with the simulated route Mason's Bronco would have taken in the ice and snow the night Emily vanished. A trooper pulled the old file and added another layer of confirmation. In 1979, Mason had stated he did not drive anywhere that night. Yet the only route a 1978 Bronco could have taken, and the only route that led to Eklutna Lake, completely ruled out the possibility that Mason stayed home if his Bronco was there. The final data layer was switched on: deposition zones, areas where heavy objects could slide beneath the ice surface when temperatures plummeted after a storm. That zone overlapped perfectly with where Mason's VIN-tagged metal plate was recovered. The final GIS reconstruction report appeared automatically on the screen. Route simulation probability, high. Mason's 1978 Bronco would have necessarily passed through the area where evidence was recovered. No further explanation was needed in the room. The model did not merely show Mason could have been there, it showed he almost certainly drove his Bronco through the exact spot where the evidence was later found, at the precise time Emily Hartman disappeared from the Anchorage depot. And with that conclusion, the troopers knew they had just driven the first GIS nail into a suspicion that had lasted more than 3 decades. The troopers contacted Fairbanks PD and requested assistance in bringing Howard Mason to the station on the morning of August 14, 2014. The notice was sent as an interview request, not an arrest warrant, because although the chain of evidence was tightening, the case still needed Mason's formal statement, especially after the GIS model and the restored Polaroid clearly placed a man matching his build at the Anchorage depot the night Emily vanished. Mason arrived nearly 40 minutes late, walking heavily with an expression that mixed irritation and caution. He sat across from the 2 investigators, placed his ball cap on the table, and clasped his hands as if preparing for a long interrogation. When the troopers began with routine questions, where he lived in 1979, what he did for work, his usual travel routes, Mason answered fluently, not differing much from the old record. But the moment the questions turned to the night Emily disappeared, the atmosphere changed instantly. One trooper opened the 1979 file and read Mason's original statement, verbatim. "I was home all night, working on things in the garage, didn't drive anywhere." Mason nodded and stuck to his story. "That's right, I already told you. I never left the house." The investigator looked him in the eye. "Are you sure you want to stand by that statement, Mr. Mason?" Mason frowned and shrugged slightly. "I have nothing to change." The troopers placed a restored, enlarged print of the Polaroid in front of him, the details now sharp enough to be undeniable. Beneath the 3rd streetlight, the silhouette of a man standing a few steps behind Emily was unmistakable. "Do you see anything in this picture?" Mason glanced at it. "Just somebody's shadow, not me." An investigator turned the photo and pointed to the figure. Based on shoulder-to-height ratio, stature and body structure analysis, the image shows a man whose characteristics match 80% of the 1979 composite, derived from witness descriptions. Mason narrowed his eyes and tilted his head a little. "I don't know anything about that. I wasn't there." The troopers did not argue directly. They placed the Forensic Center's report on the table, a 3D GIS reconstruction showing the only route a 1978 Bronco could have driven in that blizzard led straight from the Anchorage depot to Eklutna Lake. "You said you never left the house," the investigator said slowly. "But meteorological models, 1979 snow maps, and restored traffic data show a 1978 Bronco traveled the Glen Highway between 2240 and 2315. Mason stiffened. "Those simulations, how can you be sure?" The investigator replied, "Because a brown-painted metal fragment found at Eklutna Lake bears the VIN of the exact Bronco registered to you." 100% match. Mason's knuckles went white as he gripped his hands tighter. For the first time he did not answer immediately. A short silence, not long, but enough for the 2 troopers to exchange a glance and note the shift. The investigator continued. "You said the Bronco stayed home that night." "That's right," Mason answered, voice dry. "Then why are parts of it at the bottom of the lake?" Mason closed his eyes for a second, as if searching for a reasonable answer. "Maybe somebody took my truck," he said, his voice trembling slightly, but trying to stay calm. "I don't remember everything. It was a long time ago." The troopers immediately wrote down the statement, a complete departure from his original 1979 testimony. "You never mentioned anyone borrowing the truck back then," the investigator reminded him. "You said clearly the vehicle never left the house." But now you're saying maybe somebody took it. Do you want to amend your statement? Mason took a deep breath, still avoiding eye contact. I didn't think much about it then. I don't remember the details. The investigator placed the leather strip on the table, sealed in a clear evidence bag. Do you know what we found on the inside of this piece of leather? Mason looked at the bag but said nothing. Your DNA, from the sample you gave in 2003 for the workplace injury case. 94% match. The second trooper, who had been silent most of the interview, finally spoke. Mr. Mason, we have a picture of you near Emily. We have a GIS route, proving your truck had to go through that area. We have parts of your Bronco under the lake, and now we have your DNA on the leather strip found in the same place. Mason's shoulders tensed. His gaze darted away. His breathing grew faster. I didn't do anything, he said. But the certainty was gone from his voice. The troopers recorded every reaction, every contradiction, every shift in his story. Every additional sentence only narrowed the gap between his words and the evidence. When he left the interview room, the entire team knew Mason's statement no longer matched reality, and with the GIS model and the restored Polaroid, the truth of that night in 1979 was no longer completely hidden in darkness. A search warrant was signed that same afternoon, after the federal prosecutor reviewed the entire chain of evidence, from the matching VIN and partial DNA to the GIS model and restored Polaroid. When the troopers arrived in Fairbanks, Mason's house sat isolated on the edge of an old neighborhood, surrounded by tall pines that filtered the late afternoon light into long stripes across the ground. Mason was standing on the porch when they pulled up, looking both defensive and exhausted after the interview. He tried to appear cooperative, but his evasive eyes showed he understood the situation had changed. When the warrant was read aloud, word for word, Mason only nodded, stepped back inside, and said nothing more. The troopers split into 3 teams, each assigned to a section of the modest but cluttered house: bedroom, living room, the garage out back, and a room Mason called his office that had clearly been turned into long-term storage. Every member wore a body camera recording the entire search per 2014 protocol. In the dusty living room that smelled of damp wood, one trooper found an old drawer full of yellowed folded maps. Most were fishing maps, forest road maps, and auto repair manuals, but it didn't take long to spot one that stood out: a 1979 Glen Highway map, reprinted in 1978, covered in red crayon marks, made by Mason. Most striking were small slash marks along roads heading north from Anchorage and a circled area near Ekalutna Lake, almost exactly where the metal evidence was found in 2013. When the trooper flipped it over, he saw short handwritten notes in block letters: side road rough, deep snow, wait for wind shift, and one line half erased but still legible: depot. No one said a word, but they all knew this was no longer coincidence. The map was laid on the table, photographed from multiple angles with rulers and proper lighting, then sealed according to procedure. In the next room, another team opened a creaking wooden cabinet and on the second shelf found a small cardboard box with a torn lid. Inside were nearly 30 old Polaroids, edges yellowed and many corners curled from moisture. As the evidence tech flipped through them, he paused. Most were young women photographed in low light, mostly outdoors or in a garage. Some appeared taken from a distance without consent. Others had the bottom deliberately cropped off, as if Mason had trimmed the frame to keep only the part he wanted. One photo made the entire team stop longer. A Polaroid of a young woman standing beside a streetlight, her posture vaguely resembling Emily, though not conclusive. Although most of the photos did not directly prove criminal acts, the quantity of hidden Polaroids of young women, kept in a zippered cabinet, led the troopers to classify them as potentially related to stalking, voyeurism, or long-term fixation. All photos were laid out, numbered, photographed as evidence, then sealed separately in anti-moisture bags to prevent further chemical degradation of the Polaroid emulsion. In the garage where Mason had worked for years, the troopers opened a large rusted metal tool cabinet. Inside were ordinary tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, tie-down straps, old boxes of screws, but in the bottom drawer they found a pair of dark brown leather gloves, old but still holding their shape. When the trooper lifted them, a smell of damp leather and machine oil wafted out, and when he turned the left glove inside out, a key detail appeared. The grain and stitching were nearly identical to the structure of the leather strip, recovered from Eklutna Lake in 2013. A faint scratch ran along the left cuff, matching the tear pattern on the reference fragment. The forensic team examined the inner surface under UV light for possible biological traces, but took no samples on site. Protocol required the entire gloves to be sealed untouched for later lab analysis. No one needed to say it aloud. If the lake leather came from these gloves, or identical material, it would be one of the most direct links tying Mason to the scene of Emily's disappearance. When the search extended to the storage area behind the garage, the troopers found additional odd items: brown paint flakes on a dented toolbox, a canvas bag with a broken strap, and another map marked near Chugach, an area searched in 1979, but yielding nothing because of the blizzard. Each item was photographed at 90-degree angles to preserve scale and context, then placed in labeled, time-stamped evidence bags. The entire process was deliberate and meticulous. No margin for even the smallest error, because the troopers knew any of these items could become pivotal in court. After 3 hours, every corner of Mason's house had been fully documented. All maps, Polaroids, leather gloves, and suspicious items were loaded into evidence crates, triple-sealed, and transported directly to Anchorage in a secured vehicle. As the troopers left, Mason stood in the doorway, face pale, eyes fixed on the evidence crates, as if he could feel what lay ahead. The air was thick with heavy silence, the kind of silence familiar in cases where the truth, after decades, finally begins to rise from the mud and ice of the past. The Alaska State Troopers Image Analysis Unit received the evidence crate containing nearly 30 Polaroids seized from Mason's house, and within the first few minutes, they realized these were not random snapshots, but a deliberate collection. All young women, mostly observed from a distance, in low light, from odd angles, many manually cropped. But when they reached photo number 13, the entire team stopped, turned up the lights, and moved it to the special analysis table. That Polaroid depicted a scene anyone familiar with Case 79, Olivan 42, recognized instantly. The picture showed a woman standing beneath a high-pressure sodium streetlight at the Anchorage depot, a night scene with snow blowing sideways, cold mist swirling through the pale yellow glow, characteristic of 1970s sodium lighting. What stunned the team was not just the setting, but the exact location. The woman stood beneath the third light pole, the same pole where the 2014 restored Polaroid showed Emily's silhouette, with a man behind her. The analyst immediately locked the photo into a fixed frame, scanned it at high resolution, separated color layers, and removed time-induced noise to check for dating details or contextual matches. The lights and canopy perfectly matched the depot's 1979 structure, especially a distinctive hook-shaped paint chip on the left edge of the second awning support, a flaw repaired only in the 1982 upgrade. That paint chip was the first hard proof the photo was taken between 1978 and 1979, the exact window of Emily's disappearance. When the technician adjusted contrast curves, the snow blowing from the northeast became clearer. NOAA records showed only the night of November 29, 1979, had northeast winds that strong all winter. This made it nearly undeniable that the photo was taken the very night Emily vanished, and that Mason had possessed it for over 30 years. They continued comparing the lighting to AI-enhanced data from the restored Emily Polaroid. Ground illumination cones, light spread shadow lengths, all matched almost perfectly. The analyst measured the light angle from the pole, estimated over 6 meters tall in 1979, and found the spotlight hit the woman's left side identically to the reconstructed model from Emily's photo. The match was not only in lighting, but in position. The woman stood at a slight angle, hand on her bag strap, head tilted down and slightly toward the tracks. The exact posture, Two 1979 witnesses described Emily, assuming minutes before she disappeared. Although Mason's Polaroid was not clear enough to positively identify the woman as Emily, her stance, at the precise last seen location of Emily, combined with the pole, snow depth, blowing pattern and lighting, forced the troopers to conclude. If it was not Emily, it was a woman who appeared at the exact place, exact time, under circumstances matching every data point of the disappearance night. This raised a bigger question: did Mason take this photo himself, or did someone give it to him? The troopers re-examined his 1979 statement. He insisted he did not drive, did not leave the house. Yet this photo could only have been taken from a vantage point 10-12 feet from the pole, on the right side of the platform, the same spot where Emily's Polaroid showed the shadow of a man. For certainty, the unit built a complete 3D light model of the 1979 depot and overlaid Mason's photo. The result placed the photographer exactly where witnesses described a man standing a few steps behind Emily. When the trooper zoomed into the left edge, half the shadow of a parked vehicle appeared behind the low fence, boxy shape, high roof, dark color. The classic vehicle recognition system returned the familiar result, Bronco 1977-79. No one in the room could call it coincidence anymore. A Polaroid from Mason's private box, taken at the Anchorage depot, under the right pole, on the right night, from the right angle, in the right wind and snow conditions, matching witness descriptions, lighting structure, and showing the silhouette of the exact vehicle line Mason owned. Every element stacked into an undeniable convergence. They went deeper, measuring the light spectrum on the snow surface, fine, barely trampled snow matching records from the depot between roughly 22:40 and 23 o'clock, the last window Emily was seen. When the troopers compared the woman's low ponytail to the family's original description of Emily's hair, the similarity was chilling. But what truly silenced the analysis room was the right edge border, just outside the lit area, a narrow dark silhouette of a man's shoulder moving into frame from left to right, exactly matching the direction of the shadow in the restored Emily Polaroid. This was no longer isolated coincidence. The image analysis unit concluded in their report, Polaroid #13 proves the photographer was present at Anchorage Depot on the night of the 29th of November 1979. Photographer position matches witness description of the man following Emily. Lighting, snow, and wind direction matched NOAA data. High probability, the photographer was Howard Mason. The troopers sealed the entire Polaroid set, numbered each photo, and added a new entry to the case file. Photographic evidence establishing Mason's presence at the scene on the night of the disappearance. And for the first time in over 30 years, the truth was no longer mere hypothesis. It was emerging in every snowflake, every streetlight glow, every fragment of Polaroid that Mason had unwittingly kept, like the remnants of a night he thought had been buried forever beneath Alaska's ice. The Behavioral Analysis Unit of the Alaska State Troopers, after reviewing all physical evidence, Polaroid photographs, Mason's contradictory statements, and data from the GIS reconstruction, compiled an official behavioral profile to assess the type of offender Mason most likely fit into. The result quickly aligned with a very typical category in criminology literature: opportunistic offender, a crime of opportunity perpetrator who does not plan in advance, has no clear motive or long-term behavioral pattern, but is ready to act when circumstances suddenly present an opening. The profile showed that Mason had no prior criminal record, no clear history of violence, no public acts of aggression, and none of the classic markers of an organized premeditated offender, someone who methodically prepares a sequence of criminal acts. Instead, the indicators observed by the troopers, the Polaroids of young women taken from a distance, the 1979 Glen Highway map marked with route symbols, the presence of his Bronco on that frigid night, the leather cord containing DNA, and his appearance in the photograph, all pointed to a person who did not actively plan an attack or abduction, but was easily triggered by sudden opportunities. In the analysis, the psychologist noted explicitly, there is no evidence that Mason prepared tools, lured victims, or engaged in long-term stalking. However, the The behavioral chain indicates he was capable of observing young women, noting them, storing photographs, and reacting when in close proximity to a victim under favorable circumstances. This fit perfectly with 1979 witness data describing a man standing a few steps behind Emily at the Anchorage depot, with no overt action beyond watching. Pre-offense behavior very common in the profiles of opportunistic offenders, activated by situational triggers. Mason was not the meticulous planner type, and this offender category typically lacks a distinct signature behavior, a clear personal calling card, and instead exhibits only a time-specific modus operandi, acting on impulse, exploiting objective conditions, weather, and circumstances. The night Emily disappeared occurred during a major blizzard, a critical environmental factor. In the behavioral profile, the troopers analyzed that opportunistic offenders typically act only when they perceive a low risk of detection, and the blizzard conditions, high winds, heavy snow, limited visibility, and deserted streets, created an ideal environment for an impulsive, unprepared act. Psychological analysis indicated that Mason, a mechanic accustomed to operating off-road vehicles and living in harsh climate conditions, likely felt more confident than the average person in deep snow. Thus, if he saw Emily standing alone at the depot, anxious and repeatedly looking around, that could have triggered criminal behavior in an opportunistic offender, especially if he was in an emotionally agitated or confused state. When the troopers examined the Polaroid collection at Mason's home, they identified a clear pattern. Mason occasionally photographed women without direct interaction, always from several steps away, as if observing from a controlled yet non-identifiable position. This behavior is often described as pre-contact scanning, scanning before approach, even though it does not always lead to criminal action. In the overall context, Mason's retention of the Polaroid, taken at the Anchorage depot on the night of November 29, 1979, revealed an impulsive, momentary yet lingering obsession. Opportunistic offenders sometimes keep evidence not as a traditional trophy of the crime, but as a psychological marker of the moment they crossed a moral boundary. The behavioral profile also considered Mason's age in 1979, approximately 32, a common age for opportunistic offenders to first escalate to serious criminal acts when combined with personal stress, economic context, social isolation, or psychological instability. The absence of prior convictions made him easy to overlook in the initial investigation. Yet that very absence aligned with the late-onset opportunistic behavior model, a delayed-onset impulsive criminal pattern that does not develop into a serial sequence. Because he had no prior record and no repeating criminal pattern, Mason left no criminal signature that police in 1979 could have used. This explains why the original case quickly went cold. By 2014, when behavioral analysts reviewed the full picture, they concluded, no clear motive, no evidence of long-term planning. Yet the entire sequence of behavior from the evening of November 29, 1979, aligned significantly with the profile of an opportunistic offender who acted in the moment when external conditions minimized the risk of detection. This conclusion was not intended to prove Mason committed the crime, but to explain why a case that once seemed unsolvable now revealed a terrifying logic when the pieces were placed side by side. And the behavioral profile, with all its data, made clear that Mason needed no strong motive or elaborate preparation. He only needed one moment, one snowy night, and an isolated victim beneath the cold yellow lights of the Anchorage depot. The Alaska State Troopers Crime Scene Reconstruction Unit, combining meteorological data, 3D terrain modeling, witness statements, Polaroid analysis, and physical evidence, began building a detailed simulation of the first 3 hours of the night of November 29, 1979. From the last confirmed sighting of Emily at the Anchorage depot until the blizzard peaked and all ground traces vanished completely. The simulation was not intended to assert exactly what happened, but to determine the most plausible scenario based on the sparse yet consistent evidence uncovered after 35 years. They started with the 2238, 2250 window, when witnesses confirmed Emily was standing beneath the third light pole, clutching her bag strap, repeatedly looking around, as if waiting for someone or afraid of something. The simulation placed the male figure recovered from the Polaroid in the most logical position, 4 to 5 steps behind her, standing in the shadows, just outside the circle of yellow light. That was the ideal observation spot, not close enough to draw attention, but close enough to reach her in seconds when the opportunity arose. When the NOAA northeast wind speed was modeled, blowing snow diagonally at high velocity, footfalls were muffled almost to inaudibility, especially under the acoustic bounce created by the platform canopy. This allowed an approaching person to reach Emily without her immediately noticing. The simulation reconstructed the moment she stepped out of the light pool, possibly to check the schedule board or because she thought her train was arriving. That moment was assessed as the window of vulnerability, the gap where the victim was completely isolated in the broken light of a winter night train platform. The simulation showed that a person behind her needed only 3 quick steps to block Emily's path or push her off the walkway without attracting anyone else's attention, because by then, nearly all remaining passengers had left the platform. From that point, the simulation generated 2 scenarios that both led to the same outcome. Emily was directly approached. Scenario 1, verbal approach. Scenario 2, physical grasp of the arm or shoulder as she turned. Opportunistic offender behavioral data indicated the second scenario was far more likely. An impulsive, unprepared act that exploited isolation, bad weather, and lack of observation. In both scenarios, Emily was forced to leave the station via the direction with no cameras. With the heavy snowfall rate, any footprints or drag marks were erased by wind in 5 to 8 minutes, explaining why troopers found no traces the next day. The simulation showed the most logical escape route led to the parking area on the right side of the depot, exactly where witnesses had seen a dark brown Bronco parked at an angle. From that spot to the station side exit was less than 10 seconds of movement. In the simulation, the Bronco was reconstructed to exact 1978 specifications: deep tread tires, dark brown paint, matching both witness descriptions and the AI-enhanced Polaroid scan. After the approach, the attacker could force Emily into the vehicle in under 20 seconds if she was physically controlled or backed into the dark near the truck. High winds masked nearly all sound, consistent with no one hearing screams or a struggle. When the Bronco left the parking lot, the simulation placed the time between 22:50 and 23 o'clock. Snow was falling very heavily, but the Glen Highway remained passable for a 4x4, especially a high-power Bronco. The GIS simulation used historical snow maps to identify drivable sections. The highest probability route, marked High Probability Route, ran from the Anchorage depot north on the Glen Highway, past Eagle River, then turned onto a side road toward the western shore of Eklutna Lake. Travel time under those weather conditions was estimated at 30–40 minutes. The 3D model showed that even with visibility under 20 feet, a driver familiar with the terrain, especially someone who had lived in Anchorage and worked outdoors as a mechanic, could keep the Bronco under control. The second phase of the simulation focused on Location X on the Glen Highway, the spot identified from an old snowplow operator's report of an unidentified 4x4 that appeared to have had some trouble around 3:10 a.m. Although the report did not identify the vehicle, the red dot location matched 85% with the route Mason's Bronco could have taken. At that location, the simulation showed the vehicle may have stopped or been forced to stop due to high snowpack, a minor collision, or mechanical issue. The 3D simulation generated scenarios: skidding, loss of traction, or a stop to regain control of the victim. High winds and heavy blizzard made the area completely isolated. No one could hear or see anything. The third phase of the simulation extended from 1:33 a.m., based on snow compaction and wind flow data. This was the window when the offender may have decided to dispose of evidence. The vehicle turned toward the area near the western shore of Eklutna Lake, where snow and ice accumulated deeply over a steep drop-off into the water. Using 1979 terrain maps, the model showed the vehicle could plunge into the lake if it deviated just a few meters off the side road. Easy in total darkness with snow obscuring every edge. The simulation also considered the possibility of intentionally pushing the vehicle into the lake, a scenario consistent with the Bronco never being found, and the metal fragments bearing Mason's VIN surfacing during the 2013 thaw. The depth at that location was sufficient to swallow an entire 4x4 Bronco, especially in winter when thick ice formed quickly, covering all traces within hours. From 3 o'clock to 4 a.m., the wind shifted, snow covered the parking area, the Glen Highway was deserted, and the depot was inactive. By 6 a.m. the next morning, every trace of the night's events had vanished from the surface as if they had never existed. The simulation ended with a single note: the chain of events from 2238 to 310 is fully consistent with the physical evidence, behavioral data, and 1979 weather-specific terrain modeling. For the first time in over 3 decades, the troopers had a coherent, unbroken scenario, a route both the victim and Mason's Bronco could have taken during those fateful hours when heavy snow and darkness swallowed every trace of 1979 Anchorage. The forensic report on the sunken vehicle hypothesis was prepared by the Alaska State Troopers Hydrology Geophysics Analysis Team, incorporating 1979 historical data, Eklutna Lake terrain simulations, and the metal fragments recovered during the 2013 ice melt. The report's objective was to determine whether Mason's 1978 Bronco sank due to accident, weather conditions, or deliberate action to destroy evidence, and the process had to match every detail of the evidence found 35 years later. First, the team compiled all November, December 1979 NOAA weather data, focusing on the week of Emily's disappearance. Meteorological records highlighted a key point: in the first 2 days after the blizzard, Eklutna Lake had not yet frozen solid. Large open water sections remained because strong winds pushed drifting ice to one side. Surface temperatures were low but insufficient to form thick ice, only thin, broken sheets. Shoreline areas with steep drop-offs, like the 2013 recovery site, were documented as weak ice zones, where a vehicle could sink completely if it left the side road by just a few meters. The team determined lake depth at the site using modern sonar and recent bathymetric maps. Result: average depth 6.4 to 9.2 meters, enough for a Bronco to disappear entirely without leaving surface evidence if it sank before full freeze. To better understand, they reconstructed the 1979 lake surface using geological data. Late November ice was stable only on the northern section. The western area, near where the brown paint fragment was found, remained open water due to currents and greater depth. This strongly supported the hypothesis that the Bronco slid off the side road and was pulled into the lake. However, the most critical factor was not the possibility of falling in, but evidence suggesting the vehicle was deliberately sent down rather than lost in an accident. The forensic team identified factors arguing against accident. First, no reports of anyone trapped or needing rescue on the night of November 29, 30, 1979, beyond the snowplow operator's vague note of an unidentified 4x4 that appeared unoccupied. If it had been an accident, long skid marks or out-of-control tire tracks would have been visible in the snow. But blizzard data showed 20-30 minutes of heavy snowfall was enough to erase all such traces. Why troopers in 1979 found nothing. Still, the vehicle sinking immediately after stopping aligned better with deliberate pushing. Because a 1978 Bronco was heavy, with a high center of gravity, and would not easily slide into the lake without applied force. The forensic team modeled scenarios. Low speed, loss of control, sliding onto the slope. Results showed a Bronco would only slide into the lake on its own if the front wheels were more than 1.7 meters onto the slope and the driver never braked. Reaching that position in blinding snow would require approaching the shore almost perpendicular to the lake, an angle highly unlikely in a natural accident, but perfect if the vehicle was pushed to the edge and the parking brake released. The strongest evidence came from the metal fragment bearing the VIN, recovered by laser cleaning and confirmed as Mason's Bronco. The fragment displayed clear mechanical cuts and impact damage beneath the rust. One technician noted, the vehicle sustained heavy impact on the lower edge or was crushed during descent. Simulation analysis showed that when a vehicle is pushed nearly perpendicular down the slope, the chassis twists at the water impact point, creating the distorted tear seen on the recovered painted fragment. The peeling paint followed a compressed arc pattern, perfectly consistent with near vertical drop rather than sideways slide. The hydrology specialists further analyzed 1979 lake freeze rates. NOAA records showed temperatures plummeted early on November 30th, causing open water to begin rapid freezing within hours. If the Bronco sank between 2:30 and 3:10, surrounding water would refreeze in 60–90 minutes, turning the vehicle into an object trapped beneath the surface ice, invisible from above. By morning, ice cover and an additional 12–14 centimeters of snow left the lake surface calm, as if undisturbed. This was a form of self-burying evidence created by Alaska's climate. Anyone who intentionally pushed the vehicle in would know nature would conceal everything within hours. Another key point was the 2013 fragment distribution. The VIN piece and two smaller metal pieces were found within an 11-meter radius. Hydrodynamic modeling confirmed the vehicle sank nearly intact and disintegrated very slowly over decades, rather than exploding apart from high-impact crash. This further supported a static sink, not high-speed plunge, but controlled lowering, almost guided or pushed. The forensic report stated clearly, the evidence distribution pattern suggests the vehicle did not fall accidentally, but was subjected to deliberate force. This is a disposal pattern, removing the vehicle evidence and related traces from detection range. Deeper analysis showed that if the driver wanted to hide the vehicle, Eklutna Lake was the most effective choice. Deep, fast freezing, rarely traveled at night, and only minutes away from the storm's final sweep that erased every trace. The forensic team's official conclusion, Howard Mason's vehicle could not have plunged into Eklutna Lake on its own. Physical evidence, freeze modeling, and impact vectors proved the vehicle was intentionally sent into the lake while open water remained. This was evidence disposal. With this conclusion, the troopers for the first time had scientific proof that the Bronco's presence in the lake was not an accident, but a deliberate choice made the night Emily vanished. The troopers spent the last 2 days of August 2014 compiling the entire chain of evidence gathered over nearly a year of reinvestigation, organizing it into a report exceeding 20 pages. No single smoking gun, no eyewitness to the attack, but every separate fragment linked into a logical structure that could not be explained by any scenario of Howard Mason's innocence. The report opened with a summary of physical evidence. Metal fragments bearing a VIN 100% matching Mason's registered 1978 Bronco. Smaller fragments with the same distinctive brown paint, the leather cord recovered from Eklutna Lake, containing partial DNA consistent with Mason's 2003 profile. The Polaroid collection from Mason's home, including one clearly showing the Anchorage depot on the night Emily disappeared. Next came digital analysis. The AI-restored Polaroid, showing a male figure standing only steps behind Emily, with an 80% match to the 1979 composite sketch. GIS. Reconstruction, proving the only route Mason's Bronco could have driven in the blizzard, led directly to the 2013 evidence recovery zone. And NOAA reports confirming wind and snow conditions perfectly matched the lighting, angle, and blowing snow visible in Mason's photo. Then the behavioral analysis section presented concisely, Mason fit the opportunistic offender profile, no clear motive, but prone to act on opportunity. His personal Polaroids showed a pattern of distant observation of young women, and his photograph taken at the exact location, exact time. under the same weather conditions proved he was at the depot the night Emily vanished, despite his denials. Next, the Bronco section. The geophysics report proving the vehicle sank deliberately, not accidentally. 1979 lake depth sufficient for complete disappearance within hours, and evidence distribution perfectly consistent with a Bronco sent down during that blizzard night. The troopers attached Mason's statement history. In 1979 he insisted he never left home, and the truck never moved. In 2014, faced with evidence, he changed to "someone could have taken my truck," a major contradiction revealing shifting strategy under pressure. The compiled report reconstructed the 1979 timeline using scientific data, 2238, 2250. Emily under the third light pole, 2250, 23 o'clock. Approached and forced from the platform, 23 o'clock, onward, placed in the Bronco, 2330, 3 o'clock. Bronco traveled the only viable route to Eklutna, 310 vehicle. Stopped or encountered issue at location X afterward, vehicle sent into the lake for disposal. All these facts, though no single piece was direct proof, combined into what forensic science calls a cumulative evidence pattern, a body of evidence strong enough to establish probable cause for charges. The troopers presented the report to the Alaska State Prosecutor's Office in Anchorage during a 3-hour meeting. Forensic specialists walked through each section: physical evidence, meteorological data, terrain modeling, and Mason's behavior. Prosecutors evaluated not just individual parts, but the entire chain as a complete evidence system. The more they heard, the more the case's airtight logic became clear, a clear thread from the Anchorage depot to Eklutna Lake, where cold ice had kept the secret for 35 years. Finally, the chief prosecutor reread the conclusion: the chain of circumstantial evidence reaches the level required to request an arrest warrant for Howard Allen Mason. Recommend submission to the Anchorage District Court. The troopers gathered all files, signed acknowledgments, and prepared the next step, the step they had waited 35 years for: requesting a formal arrest warrant for the sole suspect in the disappearance of Emily Hartman. The arrest warrant for Howard Allen Mason was signed at 6:40 a.m. on September 1, 2014, after the Anchorage District Judge reviewed the full 20-page report and the entire chain of evidence submitted by the troopers. Immediately upon receiving the warrant, the Fairbanks arrest team, in coordination with Alaska State troopers, executed the plan to approach Mason's house, prioritizing a low-visibility takedown tactic, discreet arrest that minimized the risk of flight or destruction of evidence. In Fairbanks, the early autumn sky was thin and gray, cold, with steam rising from the ground, forming a light fog. Mason lived on the outskirts of the city in a sparsely populated neighborhood, where houses were dozens of yards apart and the dirt driveway still bore tire tracks from the previous night. At 7:12, 3 trooper vehicles rolled slowly into the area and stopped about 30 yards from Mason's house. 2 troopers approached the front door, while another team circled to the garage to block any escape route. When they knocked, Mason appeared, hair disheveled, his face showing a shock he couldn't hide. He was wearing a thin flannel shirt with a crooked collar, his eyes darting from one trooper to another, as if searching for a gap to deny what was happening. The trooper read the warrant in a steady, clear voice. "Howard Allen Mason, you are under arrest pursuant to a warrant issued by the Anchorage District Court in connection with the 1979 disappearance of Emily Hartman." Mason didn't react immediately. He blinked several times, took one step back, hands half raised as if to speak, but his throat caught. When ordered to turn around and place his hands behind his back, he offered no resistance, yet his whole body was rigid, as if frozen. The figure-8 cuffs clicked shut with a harsh metallic sound in the quiet yard. As Mason was led off the porch, neighbors began peeking through curtains. Some recognized him, the quiet mechanic who rarely spoke, who had lived in the area for over 15 years without ever causing trouble. Their eyes reflected indescribable confusion. They couldn't connect the thin, elderly man being taken away with the suspect profile the troopers had just released. After placing Mason in the vehicle, the troopers returned to execute the supplemental search warrant to seize any additional evidence that could be re-examined in the forensics lab. They reopened cabinets not previously searched, going through old bags, cartons labeled garage parts, winter gear, or simply covered in Mason's scrawled handwriting. In a small room at the end of the hallway, suspected to be a seldom-used storage space, they found an old wooden box shoved far under a table. Inside were 3 layers of nylon bags containing Polaroid photographs, mostly of women, a few dark landscape shots, and several carefully framed surveillance-style images. Some photos had faint pencil markings on the back. D3, Rail, 29N, or incomplete letters. Among them were at least 2 Polaroids the troopers had never seen in the prior search. One taken from farther away of the third light pole at the depot, another just white snow interrupted by shadows. The troopers photographed and sealed them for subsequent light and location comparison. Nearby, inside an old winter gear bin, they located a heavy dark brown men's jacket with aged leather lining and a torn section at one cuff. Notably, the color of the inner leather cuff almost perfectly matched the leather sample recovered from Lake Eklutna, and the horizontal stitching pattern, though now mostly loose, was identical to the stitching on the gloves previously seized from the garage. They immediately laid the jacket on a white tarp, photographed it at 90 degrees standard, measured every tier precisely, then sealed it in an evidence bag for later DNA analysis and leather fiber comparison. In the garage, the troopers also found a small box of old auto parts. Among rusted screws and broken wiring, they discovered a metal piece shaped like a body-side molding, very likely from a Bronco. The remaining brown paint exactly matched the tone on the VIN fragment from the lake. The part was placed in an anti-static bag and sealed with a timestamp of 7:58. On the ride back, Mason sat in the rear seat, hands on his thighs, eyes fixed on the floor, body curled inward, as though finally realizing that the thing he had feared most for 35 years had caught up with him. No one spoke during the entire drive to the detention center. The troopers only exchanged glances in the rearview mirror, not triumphant looks, but the familiar quiet of people who know an arrest is just one part. They still had to prepare for the long chain ahead. Evidence testing, reconstructing statements, and facing an Alaska past from 1979 that was slowly rising from the ice. Mason was booked into initial intake at 9:04, cuffs removed, property inventoried, and his name entered into the detention log. Howard Allen Mason. Arrest on probable cause in case 79-1142. 35 years after the night Emily disappeared, the troopers finally had their suspect in custody, and nothing from this point forward could ever be undone. The Alaska State Prosecutor's Office began building the charging case within hours of Mason's arrival at the detention center. They assembled the entire legal team, forensic specialists, and lead trooper investigators in a secure conference room in Anchorage, spreading every document across the table. The 20-page report, forensic results, Polaroid photos, GIS data, 1979, NOAA weather records, original witness statements, search warrants, Mason's contradictory statements, and the inventory of evidence seized in Fairbanks. The goal: turn the entire chain of circumstantial evidence into a seamless, clear indictment strong enough to withstand courtroom scrutiny. The prosecution organized the evidence into forensic pillars, independent but mutually reinforcing categories. Pillar 1. VIN Mason's Bronco. The opening evidence was the restored VIN plate recovered from the metal fragment at Lake Eklutna. The lab report stated clearly 100% match with the Bronco registered to Mason in 1978. This placed Mason on the route leading to Lake Eklutna, where every trace of Emily's disappearance had been erased for 35 years. The prosecution called the VIN an unforgeable mechanical identity. Pillar 2. DNF present on the leather strap. A partial DNA profile taken from the inside of the leather strap, found beside the Bronco fragment, matched the DNA Mason provided in 2003 for a workplace accident records. The prosecution stressed there is no reasonable innocent explanation for Mason's DNA on a 30-plus-year-old strap found next to his vehicle wreckage at the bottom of Lake Eklutna, except that he handled it the night of the incident. Pillar 3. Polaroid. Mason was at Anchorage Depot the night Emily vanished. Image analysis confirmed the Polaroid, seized from Mason's house, was taken at the third light pole of Anchorage Depot, under northeast wind and snow conditions, matching NOAA data for the night of November 29, 1979. From the exact location where witnesses last saw Emily, and from the same angle as the silhouette of the man in the recovered 1979 Polaroid. The prosecution called this undeniable presence. Pillar 4. GIS. Mason drove the only possible route. From the GIS reconstruction simulation, the prosecution concluded the only route a 1978 Bronco could have taken in the 1979 blizzard conditions runs straight from the depot to Lake Eklutna. This not only placed Mason at the primary crime scene, but delivered him to the secondary disposal site. The prosecution displayed the GIS map with two glowing lines and stated, "This is not vague probability. This is the only route." Pillar 5. Behavior, and contradictory statements. The prosecution introduced Mason's shifting accounts in 1979. He said, "I was home all night." But in 2014, faced with evidence, he changed to "someone might have taken my truck." The prosecution labeled this a mens rea indicator, evidence of consciousness of guilt. After establishing 4 forensic pillars and 1 behavioral pillar, the prosecution drafted the charging section. Because there was no body and no direct proof Emily had been murdered, the prosecution avoided a murder charge that risked total acquittal. Instead, they chose a safer yet still severe strategy. Charge 1, manslaughter. They argued a spontaneous, opportunistic encounter in extreme weather that resulted in unintentional but reckless death, perfectly matching an opportunistic offender profile, plus aggravating factors of endangerment, forced movement, and abandonment under lethal conditions. Charge 2, evidence tampering. By sinking the vehicle, tearing the leather strap, and leaving evidence submerged under ice for 30 years, Mason intentionally destroyed or concealed evidence. Alaska law defines tampering broadly. Any interference that prevents investigators from accessing evidence is sufficient. The forensic record made this clear. The vehicle sank, ice formed immediately afterward, and evidence only surfaced due to the anomalous 2013 thaw. The prosecution closed their 200-word charging document with the summary: "The probability that Mason caused Emily Hartman's death exceeds every other reasonable possibility. The accumulation of physical, technical, and behavioral evidence forms a pattern that cannot be explained innocently." After 35 years of Case 79-1142, sleeping under ice, the prosecution was ready to bring the case into the light of justice. The draft indictment was sealed and prepared for filing. The trial of Howard Allen Mason opened in November 2014 in Anchorage, exactly 35 years after the night Emily Hartman vanished in the blizzard at Anchorage Depot. The courtroom was packed with reporters, retired troopers, Emily's family, and residents who had lived through 1979. People who understood this was not just a trial, but the final attempt to force the past to face justice. The prosecution opened by walking the jury through a 3-decade investigative journey, a tight logical process that overcame 1979 technological limits to reconstruct the entire chain of events, using new evidence, modern analysis, and fragments the blizzard had once erased. They projected a 1979 timeline for the jury. Emily stepping out under the third light pole, the male silhouette in the recovered Polaroid, standing a few steps behind her. The brown Bronco parked at an angle under the overhang, snow-blown white by wind, and the only route leading straight to Lake Eklutna. Everything linked in causation. The prosecution explained, "It's not one piece of evidence that makes the case. It's 35 years of pieces accumulating, starting with a Polaroid, leading to paint chips, to a VIN, to DNA, to the only route the Bronco could drive. Science, not memory, tells the truth. They showed the laser-scanned restored VIN 100% match to Mason's 1978 registration, the partial DNA on the leather strap, 94% match, the Polaroid series. Taken the exact night, exact pole, exact wind and snow per NOAA, the GIS reconstruction proving Mason's Bronco passed through the recovery zone. The prosecution described each pillar as a table leg and concluded, when all four legs are solid, the table cannot fall. Defense counsel rose and pursued the only strategy left: no body equals sign, no crime. They argued every piece of prosecution evidence was circumstantial, and in a criminal case the state must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The attorney pointed at the jury and said, "No one saw Emily attacked, no one saw Mason touch her, and most importantly, no one ever found a body." You cannot conclude a person is dead without proof of death. Defense exploited the gaps of time, 35 years of weather. No cameras, no witnesses, minimal degraded evidence. They questioned Polaroid clarity, old photos, poor light, blurry figure, called GIS, simulation, not reality, cast doubt on partial DNA, possible contamination, and hammered the core weakness: no body, no cause of death, no direct injury, no time of death. Defense insisted the prosecution had only a logically consistent story, missing the decisive link. But the prosecution had anticipated this exact strategy. They rose calmly and countered, "Alaska law does not require a body to convict. We rely on circumstantial evidence, and the legal standard is, when all circumstantial evidence points to one reasonable conclusion, the defendant is guilty." They then displayed a chart of Alaska cases with no body that still resulted in conviction, emphasizing that circumstantial evidence is not weaker than direct. It is often stronger because it comes from multiple independent scientific sources. The prosecution continued, "If Mason is unconnected, why is his truck's VIN at the bottom of Lake Eklutna? Why is his DNA on leather next to it? Why does he possess a Polaroid taken the exact night Emily vanished? Why does the only GIS route from the train station go straight to the evidence site? And why did he lie for 35 years about never leaving home?" Turning to the jury, in the real world, random events don't line up like this. This is not coincidence. These are the footprints of truth. The court heard meteorological, geophysical, behavioral psychology, and forensic conclusions. Layer by layer, the prosecution dismantled the no body equals sign, no crime argument. By proving the case never lacked a body, nature had simply held the body and the truck under ice for 35 years. The trial's climax came when the prosecution displayed an overlay composite, Mason's depot Polaroid, beside the recovered 1979 Polaroid, beside the GIS map, beside photos of the lake evidence, all fitting together like pieces of a single puzzle. Defense had little left but to repeat no body, but when the prosecution stood for their final words, they said only, "The body is gone." But the truth never left. The case went to the jury. The jury deliberated for exactly 3 hours and 18 minutes, an unusually short time for a no-body, no direct injury case, built entirely on 35-year-old circumstantial evidence. When they returned, the courtroom was as tense and still as the surface of Lake Eklutna before the thaw. Every eye, Emily's family, press, retired and active troopers, prosecution, defense, fixed on the 12 faces. The foreperson, a resolute woman in her mid-50s, stood, holding the folded verdict form. "We have, Your Honor." Mason's side of the table shifted slightly, as if he wanted to stand, but his body refused. His face went ashen, eyes flicking rapidly between his attorney and the jury, then dropping to the floor. On count 1, manslaughter in the death of Emily Hartman in 1979. We find the defendant guilty. A sharp inhale and muffled sob came from the back. Someone in Emily's family broke, then stifled it. Mason dropped his head until his chin nearly touched his chest. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. Mason didn't react. On count 2, evidence tampering by submerging the vehicle and associated items in Lake Eklutna to obstruct investigation. We find the defendant guilty. The prosecution showed no celebration, only quiet nods to one another, acknowledging that Alaska justice sometimes arrives very, very late, but it can still arrive. Defense noted an objection, re-raising the no-body argument, but the judge overruled immediately. The jury has applied the correct Alaska standard for circumstantial evidence. The verdict stands. At sentencing, silence returned. The judge looked at the file, then at Mason, not with anger, but with the weight of someone who must say what no one in 1979 could have imagined. Howard Allen Mason, you engaged in conduct that caused the death of a young woman, Emily Hartman, and then used Alaska's weather to hide the truth. Though no body was recovered, science, data, and the evidence the jury reviewed prove your responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. Mason stared at his hands. The hands that once repaired engines, gripped the 1978 Bronco wheel, held a Polaroid camera under depot lights in 1979. The judge continued, "This court must impose a sentence that reflects the gravity of the offense, the decades of concealment, and the prolonged suffering inflicted on the victim's family." He opened the file and read, "On the count of manslaughter, 25 years imprisonment. On the count of evidence tampering, 10 years imprisonment, to run consecutively. Total 35 years imprisonment, with no eligibility for early release." A few people cried quietly, but the courtroom maintained the respectful silence of a community watching Alaska's long winter darkness, finally torn open at last. Mason closed his eyes for several seconds, as if hearing the sentence from very far away. He made no outburst, no denial, no anger, just whispered words no one could hear. His attorney asked to make a final statement. "My client maintains his innocence. We respect the court, but will consider an appeal." The judge ordered Mason to stand for recuffing. When the cuffs clicked again, the room fell completely still, not because of the metal sound, but because of what it meant. After 35 Alaska winters, Emily Hartman's disappearance finally had an ending. As troopers escorted Mason through the side door, he turned once, not toward prosecution or his lawyer, but toward the bench, where Emily's family sat. His eyes met those of Emily's now elderly mother in the front row. She said nothing, only looked back with eyes no longer angry, just exhausted, from more than half a lifetime of waiting. And that, not the sentence, was what made Mason lower his head for the last time before disappearing behind the steel door. Outside the courtroom, former and current troopers gathered in small groups, some who had served 35 years before retiring, others only a few years on the job. In that moment they were the same. They had chipped away the ice from a case everyone thought buried forever under Alaska snow. A 35-year sentence, with no early release, was not only punishment for Mason. It was the system's acknowledgement that sometimes justice takes an excruciatingly long time to find its path, but it can still reach the truth, even if all that remains are rusted metal fragments, faded Polaroids, and melting snow on Lake Eklutna. After more than 3 decades, in the hallway, a young trooper whispered, almost to himself, "We brought Emily home." No one disagreed, because in a case with no body, bringing the truth home is the only way to bring the victim home. And for the first time since 1979, Alaska felt the ice of one cold case finally begin to crack. In the 1979 Alaska story we just walked through, what lingers is not only the dramatic 35-year journey to solve the case, but a powerful reminder to today's American society about how fragile truth can be against time, nature, and human limitation. When Emily Hartman vanished under the cold yellow lights of Anchorage Depot, the 1979 investigation was immediately disadvantaged. No technology, no witnesses, no traces. That night snow covered every footprint. Lake Eklutna swallowed Mason's Bronco, and the system had to accept a painful reality. Some cases seemed destined never to be solved. Yet the unexpected 2013 re-emergence of evidence, from the VIN-bearing metal, the DNA-containing leather strap, to the AI-clarified blurry Polaroid, proved that justice can arrive very late, but it can still arrive. This is a vital lesson for modern America, where technology advances so quickly we sometimes forget it doesn't just bring convenience, it protects truth. Advances like laser VIN restoration, fragmented DNA analysis, and GIS modeling aren't merely technical achievements. They show that persistence, investment in science, and faith in progress can resurrect a case thought lost forever. For every person in today's society, this story reminds us, whether victim, family, or ordinary citizen, not to lose faith in transparency and the possibility of finding truth, even when everything has been buried under ice, public opinion, time, or technological limits. Above all, it teaches that preserving, respecting, and never underestimating even the smallest piece of data can one day save a life or return justice to a family that has waited a lifetime. Thank you for joining us in Melting the Ice on a case buried for over 3 decades. Please subscribe so you don't miss more stories where truth is brought back into the light again. See you in the next video, where we continue the journey of bringing justice back into the light.